The sound began subtly, almost like a murmur. At first, he didn't pay attention to it. He thought it might be the sound of old plumbing or some broken pipe. But as the days went by, the noises became more constant, louder. They weren't casual noises like the creaking of an old structure or the wind pushing against windows. It was something else. Something that froze his skin and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Martin's apartment was not big. It was a modest space in an old building in a city where the buildings seemed to be so close to each other that their walls often touched. It wasn't luxurious, but it was his. In his life, he had accepted solitude as a constant companion. With each passing day, the stillness of her home brought her peace. That peace, however, slowly began to crumble as the noises intensified. At first, he thought he was crazy, that maybe he was losing his mind. Throughout her life, she had dealt with stress and anxiety, but something about those sounds was just fine for her. Disturbing. They were low, almost unintelligible at first. A soft tapping, a deep vibration that didn't come from the walls but from somewhere below. Would they be the foundations of the building? The old elevator that went up and down at all hours? But the nights passed and the noises grew, as did the feeling that something was not right. They were no longer mere tapping. Now he could hear whispers, as if someone was whispering his name from the shadows of the floor below. The first real awakening of the restlessness occurred one night. After several weeks of hearing those strange sounds, Martin woke up in the middle of the night, agitated, sweat soaking his forehead. He sat up quickly, trembling, as if something had touched him. There was a chill in the air, a chill that did not come from the open window but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was then that he heard it clearly, a dragging, as if something heavy was dragging on the ground. He was not human. It couldn't be. The feeling of dread enveloped him completely. Without thinking, he got out of bed and went out into the hallway. He looked at the door of the apartment next door. It was empty. It had always been empty. There had never been anyone on the lower floor. Martin had investigated at first, looking for answers to those noises, but he had never found anything. Something didn't fit. Something in that building was completely wrong. He decided to take matters into his own hands. If the noises were coming from the lower floor and no one was there, then what was causing them? And why did he feel those noises calling to him, as if someone were whispering to him in the dark? The basement door was locked, but that didn't stop Martin. That night, armed with a flashlight and a determination that arose from pure fear, he went into the basement. At first, his flashlight barely shone a couple of meters in front of him, but as he advanced, the air became denser. The stench as of stagnant moisture filled his lungs and made him cough. Something was not right. Not only was the air strange, but the walls seemed to be full of scars, marks I couldn't identify. The feeling that someone was watching him grew with each step he took. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. Darkness grew around him, and for a moment he thought the world was fading away. Then a noise made him stop. A dull thud, a creak, as if something heavy was moving in the dark. Martin swallowed hard and kept going, although his body asked him to flee. Finally, the flashlight shone on a figure, a shadow in the darkest corner of the basement. The first thing he noticed was the shape of this creature. Its body was tall, skeletal, covered in pale gray skin that seemed to absorb light. The eyes, if I could call them eyes, were two black, empty orbs, glowing with a yellow, inhuman light. That creature was not human nor animal. It was something much older, something that was hiding in the shadows, feeding on something I couldn't understand. Martin could not move. He was paralyzed with terror. The creature, with slow but sure movements, began to crawl towards him. Every step he took echoed off the walls as if the ground was shaking. Martin tried to back up, but his legs did not respond. Fear had trapped him. The creature got closer and closer. A cold breath ran down Martin's back, and darkness closed around him. He could feel the weight of that presence, as if he were being absorbed by it, as if the shadows themselves were surrounding him, taking possession of his being. At that moment, the flashlight flickered again, and in the darkness, Martin could hear a whisper, one he would never forget. "It's too late." The shadow of the creature spread through the basement, and Martin, unable to react, fell to the ground. The creature silently moved even closer, brushing its skin with its icy touch. The creature then began to speak in a strange whisper, a murmur that seemed to penetrate its mind. He told him dark stories, stories of those who had fallen before him, those who had come too close to the lower floor and paid the price. There were beings, entities, dwelling in darkness, waiting to be awakened. Martin, hearing those words, felt his soul being torn apart. An indescribable fear consumed him as the creature dragged him into the shadows. At that moment, Martin understood the worst of all. Not only was the creature a being who lived in darkness, but that darkness was his home, and he had stepped into his realm beyond what was allowed. Terror enveloped every corner of the apartment as the figure disappeared from their sight. No one saw Martin again. No one heard the strange noises coming from the lower floor again. The creature, however, continued to wait, feeding on the darkness and the lost souls that time and again fell into its trap. A few months later, a new tenant moved into the building, and that same night, the whispers on the lower floor began again. It all started one afternoon like any other. Joseph was at home alone as always. He was a man of quiet life, nothing out of the ordinary. His daily routine consisted of working in his office, eating a light dinner, and sleeping early. He had left behind a relationship that had marked him, and now he lived in this house with an air of loneliness that comforted him. The walls of her home, though gray and somewhat worn, had something cozy about them. There was something about them that gave him peace, though he had never stopped to wonder what it was exactly. One day, as he was getting ready to leave for work, he looked at himself in the hallway mirror. He was adjusting his tie when, for a fleeting moment, something in his reflection made him stop. It wasn't something I could identify at first, just a flash, a shadow that seemed to move behind him, but when he turned his head, he saw nothing. He was alone. He didn't think much about it, attributing it to tiredness or lack of sleep. However, that night, while in the living room, he read an article on his mobile phone about strange phenomena in houses. The idea of the paranormal began to haunt his mind. The next time he passed by the hallway mirror, he saw the shadow again. This time it was more apparent, as if the figure of something was behind him, watching, stalking. But he did not move. Joseph took a deep breath, turned around, and found nothing but the normal reflection of his own face. From that day on, the shadow began to appear in every mirror in the house. On the bathroom mirror, on the small mirror on the dining table, on the mirror at the entrance of the house. It was always the same shadow, always following the same pattern, moving slowly, as if it had a life of its own. Each time Joseph looked at himself, the figure seemed to draw closer to him, as if it intended to reach him. At first, Joseph thought he was losing his mind. It was not possible. How could a shadow have a will of its own? And how could he move through each mirror in the house? But as the days went by, the shadow's behavior became stranger. In the bathroom mirror, he could see how the shadow seemed to lengthen, stretch towards him, as if he wanted to touch him. In the reflection of the hallway, the shadow was beginning to change shape. It was no longer just a dark outline. I could see how the shadow formed a human figure, but it was blurry, undefined. Jose began to feel observed. It didn't matter where I was inside the house. He could no longer escape his own gaze in the mirror, the shadow that stalked him from the reflections. Every time I walked into a room and saw the mirror, I could feel the shadow getting closer and closer. He was no longer sure if he was only seeing what his mind was suggesting to him, or if somehow that shadow was actually following him. One night, after having been at home all day, the shadow became more apparent than ever. As Joseph walked down the hall, he felt a presence behind him. It wasn't like other times, when she had felt that something strange was happening to her when she looked in the mirrors. This time, the feeling was more real. The shadow in the hallway mirror seemed to move on its own, swirling around him as if to catch him. Joseph backed away quickly, his heart pounding. He looked around, but there was nothing in the house that could explain it. He ran to the dining room looking for something that could make sense of it all. Fear began to take hold of him. He couldn't comprehend what was happening, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, he couldn't sleep. He decided to stay in the dining room without taking his eyes off the mirror. The shadow appeared again, sharper, more defined, drawing closer and closer to him. He was a human figure like a specter, but with something dark about his being. The shadow seemed to be breathing, waiting for the right moment to move forward. Jose could feel the air getting heavier around him. Fear invaded him completely. He decided that he had to do something, that he could not continue to live with that presence, with that figure that stalked him from the mirrors. But when he looked back into the hallway mirror, the shadow was closer than it had been before. This time, not only was he approaching, but he seemed to be moving towards him in a violent manner. Joseph felt his chest tighten, that something strange was happening. It was as if the shadow wanted to trap him, to possess him. Terrified, he tried to run out to the door, but before he could open it, the shadow materialized. He was no longer a mere figure reflected in mirrors. He had crossed over into the real world. Joseph could see the shadow take on human form, a disfigured-looking figure with empty eyes and an expression of anger and despair. The shadow surrounded him, and he, in his utter panic, couldn't move. Terror had paralyzed him. He wanted to scream, but his voice choked in his throat. The shadow began to whisper in his ear, incomprehensible words as if he were speaking to him in an ancient language, one that Joseph had never heard. Desperation invaded him completely. Fear had consumed him. He tried to back away, but he couldn't. The shadow kept him trapped. It was as if he were in an invisible prison that prevented him from escaping. The horror of what I was experiencing made everything even more real. The shadow not only followed him, now he touched him, brushed him with his cold hands, transmitting a feeling of pure evil. Joseph closed his eyes, trying to escape, but as he opened them, he realized that the shadow was completely above him. His hands were no longer cold but frozen, and they could feel him being dragged into the darkness from which he had emerged. Finally, the shadow absorbed him completely. There were no screams, no lights, no sign of life. Only the house remained silent. The mirror in the hallway, however, was still there, reflecting an empty image, that of an empty, gloomy room. From that day on, no one saw Joseph again. The house remained intact, but the mirrors never reflected the same again. In the hallway where Joseph had been trapped, the reflections were beginning to show a new figure, a shadow that moved slowly, waiting to be seen by the next one who dared to approach the mirror. The curse of reflection continued. In that home now there was only the echo of a dark presence silently waiting for the next victim to fall under its influence. No one knows what really happened to Joseph. What is clear is that, from that moment on, the shadows in the mirrors would never again be something innocent. Because sometimes what the glass reflects is not just a reflection, but something much more terrifying, something that can no longer be discarded by the human eye. The house was in absolute silence. The usual noises of everyday life had faded away, leaving an eerie stillness in the air. Rosa, the woman who lived in the house, walked through the halls with a feeling of discomfort that she could not shake. There was something strange about the air, something she couldn't identify, but that made her feel observed. The house had been his refuge for years, but lately everything had changed. Something felt out of place. One night, while Rosa was sitting in the living room trying to focus on a book, the sound came. It was a soft cry at first, almost imperceptible, as if it came from a distant place. But after a few minutes, the crying intensified, as if the child were closer. A shiver ran down his spine and his breathing became heavy. The crying was strange. It didn't sound like a child seeking comfort. There was something distorted about the sound, something that caused fear to take hold of her. Rosa stood up suddenly, throwing the book on the floor. He walked towards the door of the hallway, looking cautiously around. The crying seemed to be coming from a specific place, a room at the end of the hallway. An antique cupboard covered with a layer of dust was there, like a monument forgotten in time. The crying came from there, from inside that closet. Fear invaded her completely, but something pushed her to investigate. He approached slowly, with each step feeling his heart pounding in his chest. The closet door was closed, but the sound kept increasing in volume, heartbreaking, as if the boy was calling for help. Rosa, with a mixture of curiosity and terror, reached out to the handle of the closet. As he touched her, a shudder ran through her entire body, as if the door was being guarded by something invisible, something that didn't want her to enter. With a superhuman effort, he opened the door. Inside, everything was dark and dusty. There were no children, but the crying was still heard, louder than ever. A cold air emanated from inside the closet, freezing his bones instantly. Rosa stepped forward, her breathing fluttering and her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind caused the closet door to slam shut. Rosa turned around, terrified, but there was nothing. No children, no sound. Only the silence that had taken over the house again. However, fear was still nailed to his chest like an unbearable weight. She decided to go to her daughter's room to make sure she wasn't there, alone in the middle of the night. When she reached her door, something stopped her. A small whisper, almost inaudible, but enough to make his skin stand on end. He turned the knob and went in. His daughter slept soundly in his bed, his breathing calm. Rosa breathed a sigh of relief, but something was wrong. The boy in the closet couldn't be a dream. It couldn't be an illusion. There was something there, something I couldn't explain. The following days became stranger. Each night, the boy's cry seemed to resonate louder. Rosa tried to ignore him, thinking that perhaps he was imagining things. But every time she approached the closet, she felt a pressure in the air, as if she were being watched by something she couldn't see. A few days later, he decided to investigate further. She remembered that when she bought the house, the real estate agent had mentioned something about a former tenant who had mysteriously disappeared many years earlier. However, he never gave much importance to that story. Now I thought about it with a growing sense of horror. Rosa began to look for information about the history of the house. What she found left her speechless. The boy who had disappeared into the house was a little boy named Lucas, who had lived there with his mother. According to local legends, Lucas had died under strange circumstances, and his mother had disappeared shortly thereafter. No one had seen the woman again, but the boy, according to rumors, never stopped crying. His spirit was trapped in the house, and the cry of his lost soul could be heard every night. The truth struck Rosa with a force that left her paralyzed. The crying child was not a living child. It couldn't be. It was the spirit of Lucas, trapped in some corner of the house, seeking comfort, seeking peace. But I couldn't find it. Something had kept her soul trapped, and Rosa soon discovered that this thing was much darker than she imagined. One night, after hours of listening to the crying in her dreams, Rosa woke up suddenly. The crying no longer came only from the closet. Now it was all over the house, echoing around every corner. Rosa got up quickly, ran through the corridors, trying to find the origin of that terrifying sound. He came to the dining room, and there, in the center of the room, he saw a figure. The boy stood there, his face as pale as death, his eyes large and dark, and his body covered with dark spots that seemed to move of their own accord. The boy stared at her but said nothing. I just cried. The sense of terror that Rosa experienced was indescribable. He couldn't move. I was paralyzed. She didn't know if the boy saw her or if her soul was simply lost, trapped in a state of eternal despair. The crying grew louder, more piercing, and Rosa felt the pressure in her chest increase. The air was thick, heavy, and seemed to get colder and colder. The child's figure began to fade, but his crying did not stop. Instead, a dark shadow emerged from the ground, taking the form of a monstrous figure. Rosa tried to back up, but her legs didn't respond. The creature advanced toward her, its icy breath enveloping the room, its vacant gaze piercing her. The creature slowly approached, and Rosa could see that its eyes were not human eyes. They were two dark, empty orbs like an endless abyss. A scream formed in her throat, but terror consumed her completely. The figure lunged at her, and before she could comprehend what was happening, the shadow enveloped her body, taking her soul, carrying her into the depths of darkness. The boy had been just a disguise, a facade for a much older, much more evil entity that had been stalking the house for generations. Rosa couldn't escape. The house had claimed her soul, as it had done so many others before her. Since then, the house has remained silent once again. No one dared to approach her. Passers-by said that on dark nights, they could hear the cry of a child, mixed with the whispers of something else. Something that would never stop hovering in the shadows of that empty house, waiting for the next lost soul to fall into its traps. And so, the legend of the boy in the closet became a warning to all who approached the house. No one ever forgot the terror that dwelt in its walls. No one except those who had already become part of its history. The wind was blowing hard that autumn afternoon when Clara arrived at the house. She had decided to call her new home. After months of a hectic life, of pain that he could not let go, he finally sat behind the wheel of his car, looking towards the horizon as the last light of the day slowly disappeared. The house was all he had left, a desperate option, a way to escape from everything he had left behind. He needed peace, some calm that would allow him to start over. The house was imposing in its antiquity, with stone walls that seemed to have stood the test of centuries. The glass windows were tall and narrow, as if they wanted to see the world but at the same time avoid it. The wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, and Clara felt a strange vibration in the air, a sense of something watching. He shook his head, trying to ignore the thought. Perhaps it was just the fear of the unknown, of what he had not yet had time to explore. At first, the days at home seemed normal. Clara spent her mornings unpacking and cleaning, getting used to the noises of the old house, the creaking of the wood under her feet, the wind whispering through the cracks in the windows. None of that troubled her. But one night, everything changed. She was lying on her bed when a murmur under the door of her room woke her up. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then he made out words. Those were his own words. He heard fragments of a conversation that he did not remember having, phrases that sounded familiar, but that he did not know where they came from. He got out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He approached the door cautiously, the heavy air of inexplicable tension. He opened the door slowly, but no one was there. There was no trace of what he had heard. A hallucination? She thought, taking a breath, but something inside her knew it wasn't. Panic began to slowly rise in his chest. The house was not normal. Something strange was happening. From that night on, the echoes continued. They were not always the same words, nor the same phrases. Sometimes echoes would come from the kitchen as she cooked. Other times they were in the hallway, muttering in a language she didn't understand, but somehow made her feel trapped, as if those voices were coming from a deep, dark place beyond the visible. She began to notice that the echoes were not only repeating what she had said in the past few days, but also what had not yet happened. One afternoon, while cleaning the windows in the main room, she overheard a conversation that left her cold. It was his own voice speaking to someone, but that someone wasn't there. Clara felt as if the ground under her feet was crumbling. In the echo, he could clearly hear his own words saying something he had never said, a phrase he had not yet predicted. This is just the beginning. What is to come is much worse. She tried to ignore it, to think that maybe she was just scared, but each time the echoes became clearer, more terrifying. And worst of all, they were not only talking about the past, but also about the future, about events that had not yet happened, but that somehow she knew, as if she had already lived them. The noises increased, filling every corner of the house, but the worst of all was that I couldn't escape them. They were in every room, in every corner. The echoes of his own life, his thoughts, his fears, his conversations, all floating in the air, waiting to be heard. In the early morning of a day that she did not know if she had arrived or if she was still part of the nightmare, Clara heard something that paralyzed her. It was a complete conversation, a conversation between herself and another voice, a voice she didn't know, a masculine voice, soft but authoritative, and every word he uttered was like a sharp knife, poking his mind. The voice asked her something that left her cold. "Are you ready to face what you have unleashed?" Clara got out of bed, feeling the weight of fear taking over her body. Something was terribly wrong with that house, something I couldn't comprehend. The echoes spoke not only of things that had not yet happened, but also of things that Clara had forgotten, moments that she herself had wanted to leave behind. Echoes of her childhood, of her family, of her first love. Everything was mixed in a whirlwind of memories and fears. The house seemed to know her more than she did. And with each new echo, the more it took hold of his mind, the more reality vanished. One night, after having heard another frightful echo, he dared to go out into the back garden. He thought that fresh air could clear his mind, give him some clarity. However, when he arrived at the garden, he noticed something strange. The shadows of the house seemed to stretch longer than they should, as if the night itself had warped around it. Clara felt a shudder run through her body, but she couldn't go back. I was trapped, but I didn't know why. Suddenly, the echoes became more intense, closer. It was as if the house was alive, breathing through those murmurs. The male voice spoke to her again, this time with greater force, with more power. "The house has collected all your emotions, your fears, your deepest desires. Nothing you do can escape. This is your prison. You can't run away from yourself." Fear enveloped her completely. Clara began to run, but she could not escape. Every step she took, the echoes followed. The walls of the house seemed to close in on her as if they were absorbing her. Memories and voices melted into hellish chaos, overflowing her mind, drowning her. The house wouldn't let her go. She couldn't get rid of her. Finally, Clara found what she had been looking for, the way out. She ran towards the front door, wishing with all her soul for it to be over. But upon getting there, the door closed on its own, as if it was being pushed from within. The walls rumbled with distorted echoes, and Clara knew at that moment that she could not escape. The house had completely absorbed her. The house was already part of it. The last voice she heard before everything turned dark was hers, her words echoing in her mind with terrifying clarity. "I will never be able to escape this." The house, with its echoes, swallowed his soul, as it did all the souls that dared to enter its darkness. No one else came back in, but the voices continued echoing through the house, repeating the same phrases, the same memories, trapped in an endless loop. And so the House of Echoes remained, waiting for the next person who, like Clara, thought might start over. Years ago, archaeologist Enrique Martinez had dedicated his life to the study of ancient cultures. Since he was a child, he had been attracted by history and vanished civilizations. He had traveled continents, unearthed secrets, and unraveled enigmas. But what awaited him that afternoon at an excavation in a remote South American village would surpass anything he had seen before. An old legend circulating in the local community told of a reliquary, an object of ancient power that possessed the ability to unleash the worst of horrors. In the village, they called it the Reliquary of Death. No one dared to approach the excavation area for fear that the dark forces would awaken. However, Henry, with his insatiable desire for knowledge and his skepticism about such stories, ignored the warnings and decided to delve deeper into the search. One day, after weeks of meticulous work, Enrique and his team discovered something they didn't expect. Among the rubble of a structure that dated back centuries, something metallic glowed faintly in the sunlight. At first, he thought it was just a piece of pottery, but as he cleaned it with great care, he soon realized that it was a locket, small but adorned with intricate engravings and strange symbols that seemed to move as he looked at them. With trembling hands and a mixture of excitement and caution, Henry grasped the locket. The piece seemed to have a life of its own. The aged gold shone in a way that hypnotized him. However, a shiver ran down his spine when, as he opened the locket, he felt a dark energy that was unleashed with a rumble that echoed in his chest. Suddenly, an icy air invaded the place, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, as if they wanted to devour him. Enrique took a step back, looking for the locket with his eyes, but it was too late. The evil had been released. Darkness took over his mind, and something inside him whispered, though he couldn't understand it. A heavy silence descended upon the camp. The men around him began to feel him, as if an unknown presence was stalking them, watching them from the shadows. That night, the first strange events began. The air grew heavier, the stars shone brightly, but they offered no comfort, only a warning. Enrique was alone in his tent when, suddenly, a feeling of extreme cold enveloped him. At first he thought it might be the wind, but he soon realized that it was not natural. The light of his flashlight flickered, then went out, and in the darkness he could hear a low, deep whisper, like the murmur of voices rising from the bowels of the earth itself. His hands trembled as he reached for his lighter, but as he did so, something stopped him. A pair of red eyes flashed in the darkness, watching him, looking at him with terrifying intensity. Enrique felt his heart racing, terror running through his skin. He tried to scream, but his voice choked in his throat, as if an invisible force was oppressing him. His eyes drew closer and closer until Enrique felt that he was about to be dragged into that darkness. The vision suddenly faded. The store returned to calm, but Enrique knew that it had not been a dream. Something had changed inside him. The locket had not only released an evil force, but it had also left a mark on his soul. The next day, he tried to continue his work, but the atmosphere grew denser each time he approached the locket. The men in the camp began to abandon the excavations, terrified by the manifestations of the paranormal that happened every night. The voices whispered louder, and the shadows seemed to move unnaturally. Many of the workers said they saw shadowy figures slipping into the corners of their eyes. Some even began to fall ill inexplicably. A couple of days later, Enrique began to experience horrible nightmares. In his dreams, he saw a figure wrapped in a dark cloak, with red eyes and a sinister smile. The figure called him, invited him to join her, to follow the path to death. Every time I woke up, I felt like I wasn't alone. An invisible presence watched him, always close. One night, in an attempt to stop what he had unleashed, Enrique returned to the place where he had found the locket. He was determined to seal it again, to return it to the place where it belonged. But when he arrived, he realized that he could not do it. The shadows around him grew thicker, and the air became thick as lead. Each step he took toward the locket, the stronger the pressure felt. It was as if the earth itself was alive, rejecting him. Finally, when he reached for the locket, something changed. The ground began to shake, and a deafening sound filled his ears. It was the creaking of the bowels of the earth. Suddenly, a figure materialized in front of him, shrouded in absolute darkness. He had no face, just an endless shadow. His voice echoed in Enrique's mind. "Do you think you can stop the inevitable? Do you think you can escape the fate that belongs to you?" Enrique tried to take a step back, but his body was unresponsive. The figure surrounded him, and darkness took over his being. The screams of his fellow diggers, who had returned in search of answers, coalesced into the air, echoing in his mind like a distant echo. Then, everything vanished. When Enrique woke up, he was in a dark place, surrounded by shadows. I didn't know if he was alive or dead, but it didn't matter. The reliquary had already fulfilled its purpose. He had unleashed the evil he had sought so much. The terror was complete. The story of Enrique Martinez disappeared from the face of the earth. No one knows what happened to him or his team. The records of the excavation were destroyed, and the reliquary never reappeared. Some say that echoes of their cry can be heard when the moon is full, echoing through the air as a warning to those seeking ancient objects with desires for power. The reliquary of death is still waiting in some hidden place for whoever dares to unleash terror once again. Daniel's apartment had always been his refuge, a place where the stillness of the night offered him the calm he needed so much after a tiring day. A space where shadows seemed to whisper secrets that only lonely people could understand. He had lived alone for years after the separation from his wife, and although loneliness sometimes overwhelmed him, he had learned to live with her. Life had lost its luster, but at least it remained stable. One night, as he was getting ready for sleep, Daniel noticed something strange. The digital clock light, which always flickered in the darkness of his room, seemed even dimmer than usual. Everything in the apartment was the same. The furniture in place, the TV off, the fresh air seeping through the cracks in the window. Everything seemed normal, but there was something unsettling in the air. Something I couldn't identify. He settled under the covers and closed his eyes, waiting for the dream to come as usual. However, that night something different happened. A whisper, low and barely audible, seeped into his consciousness. He thought it was a dream at first, but when he tried to ignore it, the voice became clearer, closer. "Daniel." The sound of his name, so clear in the gloom, made his skin crawl. It couldn't be possible. No one else was there. He got up quickly, looking around, but the apartment was empty, in complete silence. Even so, the voice persisted, slipping into his mind. "Daniel, you know what you did." A shiver ran down his spine. His heart began to pound, pounding his chest like a frantic drum. What was this? It couldn't be a hallucination. The voice sounded real, tangible, as if someone was in the room with him. He looked around, but there was nothing that could justify what he was hearing. The voice continued, this time with a deeper, more hissing tone, as if coming from the walls themselves. "You know what you did, and they will remind you." Daniel turned on the light from the bedside lamp, looking for a logical explanation. A dream? No, this was different. The feeling in his stomach was that of a real, palpable threat. The voice, although he couldn't see where it was coming from, seemed to come from everywhere at once. He tried to calm down, but the words echoed in his mind like an endless echo. The next morning, Daniel tried to ignore what he had experienced. He told himself that it had been just a nightmare, a manifestation of his tired mind. But that same night, when darkness took over her apartment again, the voice returned, stronger this time. "I'm watching you, I always have." Daniel got out of bed with instinctive speed, feeling that the temperature in the room had dropped drastically. The air became dense, heavy, as if the space was narrowing around him. There was no rational explanation that could be offered for what was happening, and fear began to take hold of him. He wondered if his sanity was beginning to crumble, if he was losing control of his mind. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The answer came in a whisper, but this time it was different. The voice not only spoke, but seemed to come from inside his own head, like an alien thought invading his personal space. "You know what I did, don't you? How did you forget me so easily?" The words struck his mind with such force that he fell to his knees. The voice seemed to come from a place I couldn't comprehend. His thoughts became cloudy and the sense of panic intensified. Doubt began to sow deep roots in his mind. He remembered the separation with his ex-wife, the decisions he made, the mistakes he made. But none of that seemed enough to justify the terror he felt. An idea began to form, with fear taking over his thoughts. Could this voice, this entity, be something related to his past? Something I had tried to escape from all those years? But the voice seemed to know everything, more than he wanted to admit. The next night, as darkness fell on the apartment, the voice returned with overwhelming insistence. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He picked up his phone and called a friend, but the call dropped before he could say anything. Panic overwhelmed him. He was alone, completely alone. "Daniel, do you want to know the price of your decisions?" The room was cold, the air thick and stuffy, as if he were drowning in the presence of something he could not see. The furniture, the walls, the ceiling seemed to close in on him. Each shadow seemed to lengthen unnaturally, and the light from the lamp flickered faintly. The voice began to laugh, a low, guttural laugh seeping into his brain. The feeling that something was watching him, lurking around him, became unbearable. Daniel felt as if something was dragging him along, something dark that took hold of his soul, squeezing it, making him relive his worst fears. You can't escape. You never can. Suddenly the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. They were slow, heavy steps, as if someone were walking with deliberate calm, approaching his door. Daniel's mind began to fragment. The voice continued to whisper, but he could no longer distinguish between reality and the nightmare that had taken hold of his mind. He got out of bed, but his legs didn't respond well. Anxiety dominated him. His breathing was agitated, and fear had paralyzed him. When he tried to open the door to get out, something stopped him. The door was locked from the outside, and a cold, invisible hand seemed to hold it firmly. "You know what you did. Remember?" The voice was much closer now. Terror seized him. His mind struggled to find a way out, but the shadows, thicker and denser, seemed to close in on him. He couldn't run away from his own darkness, from his own memories, from the decisions he'd made that were now in some way condemning him. Suddenly the door opened with a blood-curdling creak. Daniel took a step back, watching in horror as the figure of a woman appeared at the entrance. His eyes were empty, lifeless, and his face was a mask of pain and suffering. The woman walked toward him with terrifying slowness, as if every step she took was a sentence. "Do you remember me, Daniel?" It was as if the voice that had been harassing him for so long had finally taken shape. The woman in front of him seemed to be a manifestation of his own demons, his own guilt. Fear completely paralyzed him as the figure advanced toward him. He tried to scream, but his throat was closed and he couldn't make a sound. "Do you remember me, Daniel?" The voice repeated, this time louder, deeper, more terrifying. With a cry of despair, Daniel fell to the ground, his mind finally collapsing under the weight of the terror that had haunted him for so long. The woman leaned over him, her empty eyes fixed on his, and at that moment, Daniel understood. She was his ex-wife. The figure stared at him, smiling with an expression that mixed sadness and revenge. Before he could react, darkness completely enveloped him, and the last thing he heard was his own voice, whispering from somewhere inside his mind, "I told you. You can't escape." The room fell silent and the light went out. The shadows returned to the place where they had always been, but this time the dark presence had won. Daniel never woke up. The dense air inside the cave felt even heavier with the rustling of rocks falling around it. The hikers had barely had time to react before the ground crumbled beneath their feet, falling into a dark, cold darkness. When at last the noise of the rocks died down, they found themselves in a vast subterranean space with the walls of the cave extending upwards like gigantic pillars, and the ceiling seemingly so high that the human eye could not see the end. However, the most frightening thing of all was the silence. A silence so dense and crushing that it seemed to devour every sound, every whisper, every breath. They had come with the intention of exploring, but now they were trapped, with no way of knowing if there was a way out, or if they would ever see the light of day again. Their lanterns flickered faintly in the darkness, as if the shadows themselves wanted to take hold of them. Dust-covered bodies with some superficial wounds from falls were trying to gather around a small illuminated area. Mark, the leader of the group, was the first to react, looking up at the cave walls for any sign of a way out. His breathing was rapid, his mind trying to process what had happened. Was there a way to escape? There didn't seem to be a clear path, just the cold, rocky walls that surrounded them. Emma, his longtime companion, came up to him, her face pale and full of fear. She didn't say anything, just held onto his arm tightly. "We have to look for a way out. This can't be the only thing," Mark said. his voice trembling but determined. The group, which had arrived as a simple excursion, was now caught up in something much more terrifying. Every step they took seemed to bring them closer to an even deeper abyss, an abyss in which not only physical darkness enveloped them, but also the anguish and despair that began to take hold of them. In the midst of the chaos and bewilderment, suddenly, something changed. Faint whispers, barely audible, began to fill the air. The group members stopped, their hearts pounding. The whispers were empty, as if coming from the very walls of the cave. There was no clear source, but everyone could feel them, like a presence moving, waiting. Fear began to grow within them, like a tangible presence surrounding them. "You heard that, didn't you?" asked Liam, one of the younger hikers, looking around with eyes full of dread. No one answered. Everyone was listening, but the silence remained like a veil over them, increasing the feeling that someone was watching them. "We must keep walking," Mark said finally, his voice breaking but firm. "Maybe we can find a way out if we keep moving forward." He tried to restore the calm that everyone was beginning to lose, but deep down, he knew that anxiety was consuming him as much as everyone else. With slow steps, the group moved forward, their flashlights illuminating the contours of the walls. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the vastness of the cave, as if the echo of each movement multiplied, amplified by the darkness. The air grew denser with each passing second, and the feeling of being watched only intensified. They spent what seemed like hours walking in circles, but no matter how far they went, they couldn't find a way out. Each turn led them to a new fork in the underground labyrinth, but none seemed to lead to anything more than a new darkness, deeper and more unnerving than the last. The fear was accumulating like a constant pressure on her breasts. The flashlights began to flicker, as if the batteries were running low, but everyone knew that was impossible. They had checked the flashlights before entering. Something was interfering with the energy that fed them, and then they saw it. At the end of a corridor, just at the edge of the lantern light, a figure appeared, tall, thin, and shrouded in shadows. Although they couldn't see him clearly, something in his presence was unmistakable. He wasn't human, not completely. His movements were slow but calculated, as if he were in no hurry. His figure seemed to merge with the darkness, and despite being several meters away from them, everyone felt a chill run down their spine. It was as if his very presence was filtering the air, invading the space with a fear so palpable that it was difficult to breathe. "What's that?" asked Emma, her voice almost a whisper, afraid that the walls themselves might hear her. The figure did not respond, but his presence was enough to make each member of the group paralyzed. No one moved. No one spoke. Only the sound of his heavy breaths filled the air. Something inside them was telling them that if they got any closer, if they tried to move a single muscle, something terrible would happen. Suddenly, the figure moved towards them, slowly moving forward, its face never fully visible. Each step seemed to increase the weight of the fear that enveloped them. The tension in the air became unbearable, as if everything was about to break. Mark, fighting the terror that paralyzed him, took a step back, trying to get away from the figure, but something stopped him. An invisible force seemed to press on his chest, preventing him from moving. "We can't stay here," shouted Liam, but his voice was filled with panic and despair. He tried to run, but his legs didn't respond, as if the ground itself had become unforgiving, unable to support his weight. The figure was getting closer, and now Mark could see something that made his blood run cold. Instead of a human face, what he saw was a void, an abyss in the place of the eyes, where there was only darkness. The figure began to speak, but his words were incomprehensible, swept away by a distant echo that seemed to come from everywhere. "This is the end," the figure whispered, his voice echoing in their minds. "There is no escape from the abyss. This is where it all ends." Terror seized them in an instant. There was no way out, there was no hope. The abyss had claimed those who had tried to escape. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet began to shake violently, and the echo of a distant scream, filled with despair and pain, echoed through the walls of the cave. The figure began to fade into the darkness, but his laughter, filled with mockery and emptiness, continued to reverberate in the ears of the hikers. The last memories they had before succumbing to the abyss were the laughter and muffled screams, and the sound of rocks falling on them, as if the cave itself was closing its doors forever. The guardian of the abyss had served his purpose, and with his last laugh, The group of hikers disappeared, forever trapped in the endless darkness. Every night at exactly midnight, the sky darkened with a dense and heavy fog, while the first drops of the storm fell on the city. No one knew where they came from, or why they appeared so punctually. It seemed like a blessing at first, freshening the air and bringing relief to the sweltering warmth of the city. But as the days went by, the rain began to awaken something much darker, something that no one dared to understand. At 12 o'clock, the first drops fell gently, followed by a rain that intensified rapidly. No one dared to leave their homes when the sound of the storm began to fill everything. It was as if the rain had a life of its own, a being that felt strangely aware, as if it were watching. But the most disturbing feature of those rains was not only their arrival, they were the whispers. As the rain fell heavily, the wind rose, dragging with it voices, incomprehensible murmurs that ran through the empty streets. No one knew where they came from, but every night the whisper grew louder, closer, as if someone was right behind them, breathing into their necks. The figures also appeared, blurred shadows that faded when they were directly observed. Human silhouettes, but with an anomaly. Whenever they looked out into the rain, those figures would disappear into the mist, as if they had never been there. Still, everyone knew they were there, lurking in the dark. The first to notice something strange were the children. Small creatures that, without understanding the danger, played in the rain. But the laughter soon turned to terrified screams. Those who played near the storm began to see those figures, and some even swore they had touched them. They said that the sensation was as if the figures' hands were cold and wet, and when they touched them, they felt a pressure that made them shudder to the bone. Worst of all, when the children tried to run away, something stopped them. Their feet were glued to the ground, as if the earth itself were holding them back, as if an invisible force was dragging them back into the rain. That's when the city began to speak. The elders knew something. Everyone knew the legend, although no one dared to tell it out loud. They said that long before the city was founded, there was a small town that fell under a curse brought by an eternal storm that fell every midnight, bringing with it fear-feeding figures. No one could escape, and no one survived to tell what happened. The city had been built on the ruins of that village, but the rain, according to the elders, never went away. I had been waiting. One night, after several days in a row of heavy rains, a group of young people decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they drove into the center of the city, hoping to find a logical explanation. The rain began to fall with the same precision as always at 12 o'clock. As they walked through the deserted streets, the wind began to rustle, but this time it was different. The murmurs were not just whispers, they seemed like words that crept into their minds. At one point, one of the young men, Thomas, began to speak loudly, as if responding to someone. The others tried to stop him, but he kept walking, his eyes empty as if he were in a trance. "We can't escape. There's no way out," he murmured, his voice cracking with fear. "They are waiting for us. They are always here." The rain was falling harder now, and the murmurs turned into screams, distorted voices that filled the air with despair. The figures began to appear, gliding in the fog, slowly moving towards the group of young people. Some tried to flee, but their feet were no longer responding. Something was holding them back. Those who dared to look back saw those figures getting closer and closer, and although the shadows were vague, they could sense the presence of something much more sinister. Suddenly, one of the figures stopped in front of Thomas. His face was shrouded in shadows, but his silhouette was clear, a human figure standing in front of him. Thomas stretched out his hand as if he wanted to touch it, but the moment his fingers brushed against the figure, a heart-rending scream filled the air, and the shadow vanished into the mist, leaving only the feeling of an icy hand taking hold of his heart. The others screamed as they saw Tomas fall to the ground, his body stiff, his face distorted by terror. No one could understand what had happened. They had tried to escape, but something kept them trapped in that place. The air was getting denser, as if the storm was absorbing all the light, leaving only a dense, heavy darkness that surrounded them completely. That's when they started to see something even more terrifying. Out of the shadows emerged hundreds, perhaps thousands of figures, all with the same empty faces, all approaching with frightening slowness. The shadows intertwined, forming a mass, as if they were united by an invisible force. The air was filled with whispers, murmurs of voices speaking in forgotten languages in low, guttural tones that penetrated the brain. Some of the young men tried to run again, but their bodies were no longer responding. They felt that the city itself was holding them back, that the ground was sticky, as if the earth was alive and dragging them in. The rain was falling harder, and the air smelled of dampness, of putrefaction. Suddenly, a large shadow emerged from the center of the city, larger than all the others. Its silhouette was huge, imposing, and seemed to be made of fog, but so dense that it seemed solid. "Fears are never forgotten," whispered a deep voice echoing through the air. "We have fed off the city for generations. This rain, this storm, is nothing more than a reminder of what we left behind." The young people, paralyzed by terror, could barely move a finger. The figure drew closer, and as he did so, the whispers increased, mingling with blood-curdling screams and sobs. There was no way to escape. The whole city seemed to be alive, breathing, stalking, waiting. Then, with one last whisper of despair, the young people were swallowed by the shadows. The figures vanished as quickly as they had appeared, and the rain stopped. At dawn, when the sunlight finally reached the city, everything seemed to be calm. But in the streets, on the walls of the buildings, there remained the marks of those who had disappeared, marks that would never fade. The midnight rain had claimed others, and the city, already lifeless, was left waiting for the next storm, the next victim. And each night, at exactly midnight, the drops began to fall once more, followed by the whispers and figures that were always there, waiting. In the darkness of the night, a dull roar filled the air. The accident had been brutal. A roar of metal and glass exploding, the sensation of a violent jolt, and then emptiness. Samuel had lost consciousness. The last image in his mind was that of a blinding beacon of light coming from a fast-approaching car. I didn't remember anything else. When he woke up, his body felt strange, heavy, as if he was completely asleep. He tried to move his fingers, but the stiffness was almost unbearable. Where was it? The air was dense, cold. The first thing she noticed was that she wasn't in the hospital. Instead of the cold, white walls of an emergency room, he was reclining on a hard seat in a vehicle. At first, he didn't understand. He was in a funeral car. The smell of wood and what looked like melted wax enveloped him. The dim light came from a low lamp on the roof of the vehicle, barely illuminating the faces of the other passengers. Samuel blinked several times, waiting for his eyes to adjust. The funeral car was in motion, and the shadows inside it danced with the swaying of the road. He looked straight ahead, where the driver seemed not to pay attention to him. The figure was barely visible, shrouded in shadows, and the steering wheel was spinning incessantly, with no human movement to be perceived inside. Samuel tried to speak, but his throat was dry. He looked around. To his right was a figure wrapped in what looked like a black cloak. The face was covered by a white mask, expressionless. A shiver ran down his spine. To his left, a woman with long black hair sat with her eyes closed, with an expression of absolute detachment. He seemed not to notice his presence in the least. The air was permeated with a silence that penetrated the bones. Suddenly, the vehicle went around a sharp curve, and the sound of muffled laughter could be heard in the distance. It was like a vibration in the air, something ethereal, as if it came from a different dimension. Samuel couldn't understand it. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. Everything in his mind seemed to be woven in a tangle of confusion. He looked straight ahead again, and there in the driver's seat there was no face, only a dark figure, the silhouette of a humanoid being who did not seem to move at the pace of the chariot. The vehicle continued its journey as if it had no end. Samuel felt a sudden terror in his chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't be there. The lights flickered, and with each flash he saw something else in the other passengers. Something I couldn't clearly identify. The woman to his left seemed to have changed her position. Now she was staring at him, her eyes empty, like bottomless pits. An intense cold ran through his body, and his breathing became erratic. It was not possible that he was seeing it. Or is it? Suddenly a terrifying thought crossed his mind. He was not alone in the car. At least not in the way I thought so. He looked around once more. The other passengers sat in an eerie calm. No one moved, no one spoke. The two men in the back of the vehicle, both in dark shirts, did not appear to be alive. They were like statues. In the blink of an eye, Samuel noticed something strangely familiar surrounding them. The air no longer smelled of damp or wood. Now it smelled of damp earth, of something rotten and moldy. The feeling of panic enveloped him again. Something was not right. Involuntarily, his hands tried to hold on to the seat, but he noticed that his fingertips were purple, as if he had been motionless for hours. He couldn't move. He felt a knot in his stomach, as if an invisible weight was crushing him. A whisper broke the silence, just a murmur coming from the seat next to him. "Have you noticed?" The voice was low, almost inaudible. Samuel turned quickly to the woman to his left, who was now closer, almost as if she had moved towards him without him noticing. His face showed no emotion, but his presence was imbued with an indescribable air, as if his very soul were broken. "Don't be scared," she said, as if reading her thoughts. "This is the chariot of the dead. All who travel in it no longer belong to the world of the living." Horror flooded him. The woman's words were etched in his mind, and his eyes began to frantically search for a way out. But the vehicle had no windows. It was a lifeless container, a mobile prison. The woman continued in a barely audible whisper, "You have no turning back. The journey has already begun." Samuel tried to get up, but his legs were frozen, as if he couldn't move them. The other passengers watched him with an eerie calm. Nobody did anything. The driver was still guiding the vehicle in the endless darkness. The sounds of the engine and the road mingled with a strange buzzing in his ear, as if everything was a nightmare from which he could not wake up. Suddenly a laugh resounded in his head. She was not human. It was a deep sound which seemed to come from the very bowels of the universe. Samuel tried to cover his ears, but he couldn't stop him. It was as if that laughter was permeated in the air like an eternal curse. The passengers' faces distorted before their eyes. The woman's figure began to fade and form something horrible, something she could not comprehend, but which her instincts told her she should fear. Samuel was trapped in a dimension between life and death. I couldn't understand why or how I had gotten there, but I knew that the sense of danger was more real than ever. Everything around him was beginning to crumble, and the chariot continued to move forward endlessly. Suddenly, a lash of pain ran through his body, as if a torrent of electricity had passed through him. The world began to turn, and his vision became cloudy. At that moment, the figure in front of him in the driver's seat became more tangible. The faceless shadow now stared at him, and the driver's bony, skeletal hands adjusted the steering wheel with terrifying dexterity. "There's no turning back," the figure said, his voice raspy, echoing in his mind. "The dead travel into eternity." Samuel tried to resist, but his mind was no longer responding. The image of the vehicle, the shadows, and the distorted faces were mixed. The awareness of what was happening flooded him completely, but it was too late. Fear got the better of him. I couldn't scream anymore. The funeral cart stopped, and at that moment, a deadly cold surrounded it. The passengers were no longer mere figures. They were grotesque, horrible beings staring at him. Some with empty eyes, others with macabre smiles. Everyone knew what was coming. Samuel was no longer a traveler. He was no longer among the living. At that moment, the car opened, and he knew without a doubt that he would never see the light of day again. He had crossed the threshold. There was no turning back. Eternity awaited him. The cold morning air seemed to envelop them in a thick mist that slid through the trees like an entity unto itself. The group of friends, 5 in all, were slowly advancing along the path that led them to the heart of the forest. Every step they took was accompanied by the rustling of dry leaves beneath their feet, a sound that seemed to be amplified in the absolute silence around them. Carlos, the most enthusiastic of the group, led the way with a flashlight in his hand, his face illuminated by the warm light that contrasted with the gray of the landscape. Behind him was Lucia, his best friend, followed by Eduardo, Javier, and Laura. Everyone, gasping for breath, stood together, looking straight ahead, where the forest seemed to grow denser with each step. "Are you sure this is the house?" Lucia asked, with a tone that denoted a certain fear, although she tried to hide it. "Of course," Carlos replied with a confident smile. "I have checked it. I've been here before, but I never dared to go in. Today will be different." Eduardo, always the most skeptical, raised an eyebrow, looking at the shadows that seemed to move in the distance among the trees. Fog enveloped everything around him, but the treetops revealed flashes of light that made the scene look surreal. "I don't like this," Eduardo murmured, but no one paid any attention to him. The group continued to move forward, ignoring the weight of fear that seemed to follow them, watching them at every step. Finally, after several minutes walking in silence, They arrived at a small clearing. There, hidden among the trees, was the house. The structure was old, with broken windows and wooden walls that showed the passage of time and decay. The house, however, seemed to have something that made it stand out from the rest of the landscape. A palpable energy, as if the whole place was charged with something dark, something ancient. The door of the house was ajar, which increased the bewilderment of the friends. "This isn't right," said Laura, who had always been the most cautious of the group. His eyes swept over the doorway and his stomach churned. Despite her fear, curiosity drove her to take a step forward. "It's okay," Carlos insisted, pushing the door effortlessly. "It's just an abandoned house. Surely there is only dust and cobwebs. Come on, let's go in." The group looked around. The trees, though imposing, could not hide the fact that something strange was happening in that place. The feeling of being watched did not disappear, but intensified. But the excitement of exploring the interior of the house overcame their instincts, and one by one they entered the hall. The air inside the house was heavy, dense, as if time itself had stopped there. The walls were covered with dark stains that, at first, were thought to be simple marks of moisture. However, as they progressed, something else became apparent. In the shadows of the main room, blurred figures could be seen, as if they were watching them from the corners, waiting. Carlos turned off the lantern and, with an expression that tried to hide his discomfort, whispered, "Let's explore a little more. Surely there is nothing." At first all seemed calm, though a sense of uneasiness hung over them. Every step echoed in the void, and the echo of their voices was lost in the heavy air. But soon, a series of strange noises began to fill everything. A crunch here, a whisper there. Lucy shuddered and looked at the others, trying to see their faces, but the darkness had completely enveloped them. Eduardo took out his mobile phone to use the flashlight, but the screen flickered before turning off completely. "What the hell?" Eduardo growled, rubbing his eyes as if trying to clear the fog from his mind. It was then that a sound coming from the upper floor broke the absolute silence. A dull thud followed by something that seemed to be dragging on the floor. Lucia, visibly pale, gritted her teeth. "I don't like this," he said in a trembling voice. "There's something about this house, something that's not right." Carlos ignored her and began to climb the stairs, determined to explore. With each step, the sound of the creaking of the old wooden floor became more and more unbearable. Javier and Laura followed him closely, with fear marking his every move. Edward, for his part, remained in the hall, looking nervously at the shadows that stretched on the walls. Fear overwhelmed him, but he did not want to be the first to abandon the expedition. Upon reaching the second floor, the group found themselves in a long hallway, where open doors gave way to empty rooms. However, something else caught his attention. A room at the end of the hallway was closed with a rusty door that seemed to have remained intact despite the years. Curiosity, mixed with the growing sense of dread, pushed them closer. When they opened the door, an icy air enveloped them, as if time had frozen at that very moment. Inside, an ancient full-length mirror reflected their distorted images, as if they were seeing something that didn't belong there. Lucia's eyes widened as she saw a shadowy figure reflected in the glass. But when she turned, there was nothing behind her. The silence became absolute. The fear grew, and the shadow seemed to stretch all over the room, as if somehow the house itself wanted to devour them. "It's time to go," Eduardo said, his voice firm but nervous. He had had enough. However, before he could take a step back, the door slammed shut, leaving them trapped inside. The light from their flashlights flickered, and the sound of something heavy creeping in again was heard louder. Suddenly, an evil presence became apparent. Something ancient and powerful had been waiting, watching, and now at last it had decided to show itself. The air became denser, and the darkness around them began to come alive. A dull scream could be heard in the distance, the sound of something that was not human, something that had been part of that house long before they arrived. The walls seemed to shrink, the house creaked, and friends began to feel the pressure on their breasts, as if they were being crushed by an invisible force. The echoes of the screams began to multiply, and the feeling of panic took hold of everyone. A gasp escaped Javier's throat, and he collapsed to the ground. Lucia, terrified, tried to open the door, but her trembling hands could do nothing. A shadowy figure appeared in front of them, a tall, dark silhouette with empty eyes that reflected a darkness much deeper than the night itself. The evil that inhabited the house was there, manifesting itself in a tangible form, ready to reclaim what belonged to it. Carlos, trembling with fear, cried out, "Run!" But the figure's voice was louder, a deep, unnatural whisper creeping into their minds. "There is no escape. This is what belongs to me." Terror began to dominate everything. With no way out, no hope, the group of friends watched as the figure advanced towards them, absorbing the light of their lanterns, devouring their heat. The darkness swallowed everything. The house, old and cursed, had made its final claim. And in that last moment, the screams were absorbed by the house as if they had never existed. The story of the house in the woods ended there, with darkness as the only witness. The old house on the outskirts of the city seemed to be an ideal retreat for a man tired of the hustle and bustle of modern life. From the first moment he walked through his dusty yard and observed the crumbling walls of the house, something inside him told him that this would be his new abode. He had fallen on hard times, and the desolate place offered a kind of silent peace. The house was large, with long hallways and steps that creaked with every step. The air seemed thick, as if he was waiting for something, but the man didn't pay much attention to it. He was accustomed to solitude, and his life had always been a kind of emptiness, only full of work and misery. He did not expect that the house would change him, much less that it would awaken something in him that would haunt him until the end of his days. The man, whose name was Andrew, had acquired the property for a fraction of the original price. It didn't matter that the house was in ruins. He was determined to restore it, and that would be his project. It was all I needed, a purpose. At first, everything seemed normal. The house was full of dust and cobwebs, but nothing he couldn't clean and repair. However, on the second day of his move, while inspecting the basement, something strange happened. When he walked down the creaky stairs, he noticed an antique door that was slightly ajar. I had never seen that door before. It wasn't in the plans of the house, nor in the descriptions the realtor had given her. He decided to investigate. As he approached the door, a strange sensation ran down his spine. Something in the air was heavy, as if something was watching him. But Andrew was not one to be easily intimidated. He decided to open it. As he did so, a deafening creak filled the room, as if the world was complaining about that door opening. On the other side, he found a room that had been locked for many years. It was not a common room. He was completely isolated from the rest of the house, as if he had never been a part of it. The room was empty, save for an old wooden chair, worn by time. But what really gave him a chill was the mirror hanging on the wall. The frame was covered in dust, but what really disturbed him was his reflection. He saw himself, but in a strange way, as if something or someone else was there with him. He didn't flinch. He thought it was just an illusion brought on by the darkness. However, upon closer investigation, he found something even more disturbing. In one corner, under a layer of dust, was a small pile of personal belongings. Small memories that clearly weren't his. A pocket watch, a yellowed letter, a couple of crumpled photos. At that moment, the air around him seemed to become denser. Andres looked around, but the feeling of being watched became unbearable. He didn't know why, but he felt that something or someone had been there long before him. Something that I didn't want him to be there. Something that was waiting for him. The first night he spent in the house was strange. Andres felt restless, as if the house were alive, watching him, following his every move. In the early morning, he woke up suddenly, with the feeling that something had changed. There was a shadow in the hallway, a movement he couldn't identify. At first he thought he was dreaming, but when he got up, he realized that the lights in the house were off, and the only thing illuminating the darkness was the faint moonlight coming in through the broken windows. He tried to ignore it, but that nagging sense of being watched began to intensify. He decided to investigate the basement further, and this time he didn't limit himself to the hidden room. He walked down the long hallway, surrounded by walls that creaked as he went. Something inside him told him that he should find out what was happening in that house. Something was not right. That's when she saw it. In the deepest part of the basement, in one of the walls, there was a small crack. The crack was so subtle that it had gone unnoticed, but Andres felt that he could not ignore it. The crack was covered by a layer of dust and mold, but something inside it told him it was important. With trembling hands, Andres touched the crack, and to his surprise, the wall collapsed with a deafening noise. Inside the crack was something that took his breath away. A hidden narrow space covered by a kind of tapestry that had been left behind by someone. The room was full of things, but what disturbed him most was what he found in the center. An old broken bed, with sheets stained with something he couldn't identify. Next to it, on a small table, was a notebook. The notebook was almost intact, with worn and yellowed pages. Andres opened it cautiously. Inside, the pages were full of scribbles. They were notes, but not just any kind of notes. They were full of descriptions about him, about his movements from the moment he had arrived at the house. The details were horrifying. Every room he had visited, every object he had touched, and most terrifying of all, the exact times he had done so. Handwriting became more erratic as time went on. In the last pages, the words began to become incomprehensible, but the last sentences she managed to read were clear. "I saw you arrive, I saw you enter. You will no longer run away." Andres stepped back, feeling as if everything around him began to close. Something was deeply wrong with that house, something that had been there long before him and had never left. Suddenly he heard a noise behind him, a whisper, low and sinister. When he turned, he saw a shadow sliding down the hallway. The figure was blurry, but there was something in his eyes that stared at him, as if it was waiting for him. Andres tried to run, but his legs did not respond. The feeling of panic took hold of him. He couldn't move, he couldn't scream. He could only feel the weight of fear taking hold of him. The figure slowly approached. She was tall, thin, with skin pale as ash and dark eyes like bottomless pits. The figure smiled, and Andres felt time stand still. The man in the basement had been watching him the whole time. He had been there in the shadows waiting for Andres to arrive. The house was not his. It never was. Andres tried to escape, but when he reached the basement door, the figure was there, blocking his exit. His breath was cold, and the darkness around him closed like a heavy cloak. The man in the basement whispered one last word, "Welcome." And with that, the door slammed shut, and the house fell silent. The presence that had been lurking all along vanished, and the house was left alone again, waiting for the next tenant who dared to discover the dark secrets it harbored. It was a dark and cold night when, after hours of driving on desolate roads, David finally saw the lights of the forgotten hotel. He was alone on the journey, and the road seemed endless. The thick fog that covered the landscape gave him a sense of deep isolation, almost as if the world had disappeared. The hotel sign, covered in dust and rust, flickered faintly with the yellowish light coming from a lamp that seemed to be on the verge of going out. However, at that moment, David did not hesitate to stop his car. The cold penetrated his bones the instant he got out of the vehicle. There were no signs of life in the vicinity, only the sound of the wind blowing dry leaves. He walked slowly toward the hotel, feeling a strange writhing in his stomach, but forced himself to ignore it. He needed a place to rest, and this was the only establishment visible for miles around. As I entered, the atmosphere was charged with a silence so deep that it seemed to devour any sound. The reception was empty, but the door closed behind him with a thud, as if something was waiting that couldn't come out. The only light came from an old lamp that dimly illuminated a dusty staircase. Footsteps echoed on the creaky wooden floor as he made his way to the counter. A peculiar-looking man appeared from the shadows. His face was pale, with sunken eyes and a strange smile that could not hide his discomfort. Despite his unsettling presence, the man was kind to offer him a room. "A single night, right?" he asked, his voice as soft as the whisper of the wind outside. David nodded, feeling the discomfort of not being able to see the receptionist's face well. He was handed the key to room 23, which appeared to be the only one available, and the man pointed to a door in the dark hallway. Without thinking too much, David headed there. As he walked, the feeling of discomfort grew, as if the corridors of the hotel were alive, watching him, waiting for something. The door to room 23 creaked as it opened. Inside, everything seemed to be covered in a layer of dust and dirt, but the bed, somewhat rickety, was made, which gave him a strange sense of tranquility. On the bedside table, an oil lamp emitted a soft light, as if someone had left everything in its place, ready to receive it. David put his backpack on the floor and sat up on the bed. He decided not to think about his thoughts anymore and lay down, staring at the ceiling as he listened to the incessant creaking of the wood under his weight. The wind was howling outside, but nothing seemed out of place, at least for now. Gradually, his eyes closed, but before he fell into a deep sleep, he heard something. A whisper. It seemed far away, perhaps coming from the corridor, but he did not give it importance. As the night wore on, the sound became clearer, more insistent. It was a low murmur, as if someone were speaking in a low voice, barely audible but constant. David tried to ignore it and covered his head with his pillow. However, what troubled him most was not the whisper, but the feeling that someone else was in the room with him. The next morning, he woke up sweating. He had had a vivid nightmare filled with shadows and echoes of voices surrounding him. The sunlight barely came through the windows, but he decided it would be best to get out of there as soon as possible. However, when trying to leave, something strange happened. The door to the room wouldn't open. He tried to turn the handle hard, but it wouldn't move. A cold sweat began to run down his forehead as he felt panic wash over him. Suddenly, a soft, distant laugh could be heard behind him. He turned quickly, but no one was there. Fear caught up with him quickly and his breathing quickened. He started banging on the door in desperation. But when he looked down, something caught his attention. On the ground there were footprint marks as if someone had walked there. They were large and heavy, and seemed to vanish into thin air as if they had never existed. The atmosphere in the room felt denser, and a shudder ran through his body as he saw footprints begin to form around him. The door slammed open, leaving him with his heart racing and his body tense with fear. A dark corridor awaited him. A corridor where the shadows seemed to move strangely, as if they were watching his footsteps. He advanced cautiously, fearing what he might find, but when he reached the end of the hall, he saw a figure. A man standing in front of the window staring out. The man was of a slim build with a gloomy face, and his figure seemed to emanate a sense of deep sadness. David approached, but the man did not move. When he was close enough, the man spoke without turning. "Did you stay overnight?" he asked, his voice soft, like a whisper lost in the wind. David nodded, not knowing what to answer. The man turned it around slowly, and that's when David saw it right. His face was marked by scars and wrinkles, but the worst thing was his empty gaze, as if his soul had been ripped from his body. The feeling of terror enveloped David, and he felt a shudder in his spine. "This hotel is full of shadows," the man continued. "Shadows of those who died here. No one leaves, no one escapes." David backed away, feeling the terror paralyze him. He wanted to flee, but his legs did not respond. The man began to walk toward him, and with each step his body faded further until he became a shadow, an ethereal presence surrounding David. "You're going to stay here with us, just like the others." The room began to darken around him. The light from the oil lamp suddenly went out, and the corridor was filled with twisted shadows, figures floating aimlessly, slowly moving towards him. The feeling of despair enveloped him. He was no longer alone. The place became a prison, and the shadows of the people who had died there surrounded it. "This place never closes," whispered the shadow, "and you won't go out either." David tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. His whole body was paralyzed. The shadows enveloped him, and somehow he knew that his soul would be the next to be trapped forever. The doors of the hotel crashed shut, and the darkness consumed him completely. There were no more screams, only the eternal whisper of the lost souls that still wandered through the forgotten hotel. In a remote place where time seemed to have stopped and the wind whispered forgotten secrets, a small village lay hidden among the mountains, almost beyond the reach of man. In the distance, the mountains rose as guardians of a past that had been erased from the memories of the world. Stone houses, old and crumbling, lined the cobblestone streets, but there was no sign of life. No one lived there. The heavy air of humidity and silence enveloped the town, as if the environment itself had decided to forget its existence. The few broken windows seemed to watch those who dared to approach, their shards of glass reflecting a distorted image of the outside world, as if the place refused to be part of reality. A group of 5 travelers, tired from their long journey, arrived on the outskirts of the town. In their search for a refuge where they could rest, they were attracted by the stillness that emanated from the village, believing that perhaps there they could find relief from the exhausting road that had led them there. With backpacks slung over their shoulders and faces scarred by the sun and fatigue, they entered without hesitation, ignoring the strange premonition that was beginning to form in their hearts. It was a gray afternoon, the sky covered by dense clouds that gave a glimpse of a dim light. Despite the calm of the place, something in the air was strange, oppressive, as if the very shadows of the houses were waiting for something or someone. As travelers moved through the deserted streets, the doors of the houses were kept closed, the blinds lowered, and the typical noises of a moving people could not be heard. The feeling of emptiness was so palpable that they could almost hear the echo of their own footsteps echoing on the pavement. Suddenly, one of them, Gabriel, looked up, feeling an unsettling pressure in his chest. At the top of one of the houses, through a dirty window, he could see a blurred figure leaning out to watch them. He couldn't make out their details, but just knowing that someone or something was watching them caused a stream of cold to run down his spine. "Have you seen that?" Gabriel said quietly, still looking out the window. The group looked at him, confused, but no one could confirm what he had seen. The figure disappeared before anyone could approach or say anything. However, that strange feeling of being watched settled in the air, as if the buildings themselves and the wind whispered ancient secrets that did not want to be revealed. As they explored the village, they realized that everything was in ruins. Streets that might once have been lively and bustling were covered in brush and debris. The houses, though empty, did not appear to have been abandoned recently. There were traces of a life that once flourished there, but it had all been trapped in time. The doors were still locked with old rusty locks, and the broken windows let out drafts of icy air. The people seemed to be stuck in a perpetual present, as if an invisible force had frozen life right there at that precise moment. "This place is not right," murmured Marta, one of the travelers, as she looked at the shadows that stretched along the walls of the houses, as if something or someone was watching them. "Don't you find it strange that it's so desert?" The group continued to move forward, and as they did so, the feeling that they were not alone intensified. As they walked down the main street, each of them felt the air pressure become denser, heavier, as if the place was slowly absorbing their energy. It was then that a sound, slight but disturbing, reached his ears. The creak of a wooden door opening. The sound came from one of the houses on the left. No one dared to move immediately. A shudder ran through their bodies, and for a moment they all looked at each other silently, wondering if the sound was real or just a hallucination created by the strange atmosphere around them. "Does anyone dare to enter?" asked Tomas, the bravest of the group, although his voice sounded more fearful than he intended. No one answered. The door opened even wider, as if an invisible force was pushing it. The pressure in the air was unbearable, and each of them knew that something was not right, but none dared to turn around. With a mixture of curiosity and fear, Marta was the first to approach the door. His steps were slow, measured, as if he were walking into the unknown, a place where the rules of the real world no longer applied. When she crossed the threshold of the house, a gust of icy air enveloped her, as if the very darkness of the place was consuming her. The interior of the house was gloomy, with furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The walls, decorated with old landscape paintings that may once have been beautiful, now showed only distorted faces, as if the portraits in the painting reflected the tragedy of the place. A shiver ran through his body. I couldn't understand how a place so far from everything could have such dense energy, that feeling of death suspended in the air. "This is not right," Martha murmured, looking back at the door, where the others were watching her from the doorway. But before she could take a step back, she heard a whisper behind her. A whisper so low it seemed to come from the ground, a distorted, distant voice that barely reached his ears. "Come out. Go away." Her heart racing, Martha turned around. But before she could leave the house, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The group outside shuddered, hearing the loud sound of the door closing, and they ran towards it. But when they arrived, they found something even more terrifying. The door was sealed as if it had never existed. No one could enter or leave. Desperate, they began to look for a way to free her, but what they found inside the house left them frozen. The walls were covered with strange engraved symbols that seemed to move slowly as if they were alive. The atmosphere was dense, oppressive. The objects in the room were shaking, as if an invisible force was trying to harm them. Suddenly, Martha appeared at the window, her face pale and disfigured with terror. She tried to speak, but her mouth only uttered unintelligible words. The travelers tried to shout at him, but their voices were lost in the air. As time went on, anxiety took hold of everyone. Despite their despair, something in the back of their minds told them that they must not leave the village without solving the mystery, that something dark lurked in the shadows of those forgotten ruins. No one could escape, but no one knew how to stop the nightmare. The shadows seemed to grow, lengthening as night fell. The people were alive, but not with the life they knew. He fed on fear, on the dread that was beginning to settle in their hearts. As the hours progressed, the figures began to appear again in the broken windows, staring at them with empty eyes, the eyes of those they never forgot. Each of the travelers began to hear whispers in their ears, soft but disturbing voices telling them different things. Some asked them to stay, that the people needed them. Others ordered them to flee before it was too late. The walls, the ceilings, the windows, everything seemed to come to life, changing, twisting, and every corner of the house seemed to want to devour them. Panic turned to pure terror when, without warning, a figure materialized in front of them. A woman with a pale face and eyes as dark as the night. His presence was so overwhelming that everything around him disappeared, and all that remained was his haunting figure, floating in the air. "They stay with us. Everyone must stay," the woman said in a raspy voice. A shriek broke the air as one of the travelers attempted to flee, but the door, once open, slammed shut again, sealing everyone's fate. As darkness enveloped them completely, they understood the cruel truth. The forgotten people would no longer let them go. They were part of their history, part of their eternal cycle of terror, doomed to be watched, and ultimately forgotten by all but those who dared to enter. In the end, all that remained were the shadows. A group of explorers was gathered in a small cabin on the outskirts of a forgotten village, deep in a dark and dense jungle. No one knew for sure how old the cave they had decided to explore was. It was not marked on maps, nor was it mentioned in the villagers' accounts, but rumors of its existence had reached their ears in curious ways. No one who had gone there had ever returned to tell their story, and that mystery, that shadow in the depths, was more than enough to ignite curiosity in the adventurers. The expedition was composed of 5 people, each with specific skills and knowledge. Luis, the leader of the group, was an experienced geologist who had explored various rock formations around the world. Marta, the youngest on the team, was a biologist with a special talent for studying underground ecosystems. Jorge, a former military man, had been recruited because of his survival prowess and tactical skills. Isabel, a photographer and journalist, was there to document the entire journey and capture the evidence of the inexplicable. Finally, there was Daniel, an old friend of Luis, who had agreed to join out of a simple passion for the unknown, although he did not share the same adventurous energy as the rest. They were standing in front of the cave entrance, a large crack in the rock that seemed to swallow everything around it. The icy wind blowing from within was but a harbinger of what awaited them in the depths. The air was laden with thick humidity and a feeling of tightness that made them feel as if they were being watched. Luis gave the signal, and one by one they began to enter the darkness. At first the cave seemed calm. His footsteps echoed on the walls, and the echo lengthened strangely, as if the cave had a life of its own. The light from the flashlights they carried did not illuminate more than a few meters, which increased the feeling of being lost in an endless labyrinth. The walls were covered with moss and lichens, and the air was permeated with a rancid and unpleasant smell. As they advanced, the corridors seemed to narrow, forcing them to walk closer to each other. Suddenly, Marta stumbled upon something. As he looked down, he discovered a strange mark on the ground, a series of symbols carved deep into the rock, so old that they seemed to crumble when touched. "Look at this," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "These are not common symbols. They seem rituals, as if someone had left some kind of warning." Luis bent down to examine the marks. It makes no sense. He shouldn't be here," he murmured, his eyes sweeping over the unusual figure. Isabel began to photograph, and the flash of the camera lit up the walls for a moment. At that moment, something strange happened. There seemed to be a flicker of light at the bottom of the tunnel, a fleeting silhouette that appeared and disappeared so quickly that no one could make out what it was. Fear began to settle in their hearts. "Did anyone else see that?" asked Daniel, his voice barely audible, as if he feared breaking the silence that had gripped the cave. "We must move on," Luis replied, with a firmness that could not hide his growing concern. However, Marta and Jorge seemed undecided. The fear was there, palpable in the air, but his drive to unravel the secrets of the cave was stronger. They continued to advance, and the cave began to change. The walls, once flat and smooth, began to be covered with strange marks and drawings, symbols that seemed to move with the passage of the explorers. The sound of his footsteps became heavier and heavier, as if the cave itself was absorbing his energy. Suddenly, Isabel screamed, her pale face lit by the light of the flashlight. "Look at this," he said, pointing to one of the walls. On the rock, the markings seemed to have come to life, forming figures that shouldn't be there. twisted shadows of creatures that have never been seen before, or at least not in this world. The scout's eyes widened. The atmosphere had become dense, unbreathable, as if the place were becoming aware of its presence. But the worst was yet to come. As they went farther in, the air became even heavier, permeated with palpable fear. Suddenly, the ground began to shake. A rumbling sound, deep and distant, could be heard through the walls, as if something gigantic was waking up from a long sleep. The cave was not simply a geological formation. It was something much darker, something alive, something that should not be disturbed. The tremor intensified, and murmurs began to be heard from all directions. Like distant whispers, fragments of words that they could not understand, but that caused a deep shudder in their bones. "We have to get out of here," Jorge said, his voice agitated with panic. But when they tried to turn back, they realized that the road they had come by was no longer there. The cave seemed to have changed. The corridors were no longer the same, and the markings on the walls now glowed with a reddish light, as if they were pulsating with a life of their own. A figure appeared in front of them, standing in the hallway. She was tall, dressed in a dark cloak that seemed to float in the air. His face was covered by a mask, but his eyes shone with an unearthly intensity, filled with an unfathomable emptiness. The figure stretched out a hand towards them, pointing at them, and in that instant, a wave of terror invaded their hearts. The scouts tried to run, but the figure surrounded them. The air began to become dense, heavy, as if it were almost impossible to breathe. "What do you want from us?" shouted Marta. But the figure did not respond. Suddenly, a gust of icy wind enveloped them, and the cave seemed to open into a gigantic crevice, swallowing them in the darkness. Luis was the first to wake up, alone, in the back of a huge chamber with the others missing. The cave was now completely silent, with no signs of life. But as he got up and began to walk, he realized that the ground was covered with bones, remnants of what had been before him. And worst of all, when he looked back, he saw the figure closer than ever advancing towards him. His scream was drowned out by the noise of the cave, and all that remained was its echo. The cave of oblivion had claimed his soul. No one would get out of there alive. Horror, terror, and panic hung over them like an endless nightmare, and the cave was sealed once more, awaiting its next victim. The house was quiet, as was to be expected at that time of night. A deep, almost oppressive silence that invaded every corner of the house. Joseph was in his bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Since his wife, Anna, had died, everything had changed. The house was no longer the same, and the emptiness left by it was unbearable. Everything in her life seemed to have a gray tinge, a sense of loss that couldn't be dissipated, no matter how hard she tried. Every night in her bed, she felt that something was missing, something that she could never recover. That night, however, the air was different, heavier. The clock struck 3 o'clock in the morning, and Jose still couldn't find comfort. Suddenly, the phone began to ring, interrupting the stillness. It was an unusual sound in the house, as rarely did anyone call him at that hour. The sound of the ringing of the call was almost deafening in the silence, as if it was marked by some kind of foreshadowing. Jose, confused and somewhat frightened, sat up on the bed and looked at the phone. He didn't recognize the number on the screen, but something inside him made him feel like he had to answer. Maybe he thought it was a mistake, some kind of joke from someone playing on his pain, but the truth was that he was too curious and at the same time scared to ignore the call. Breathing heavily, he picked up the phone. "Hello," he said, his voice trembling, hardly knowing why he said it. At first, there was only absolute silence, as deep as there was in the house. Joseph frowned, wondering if it was a joke, until he heard a soft breath as if someone was on the other end of the line. A familiar breath, but one that I did not fully recognize. It was trembling, somewhat broken breathing, as if she were struggling to stay calm. And then the voice, soft and muffled, emerged into the earpiece. The voice that Joseph never thought he would hear again. The voice of Hannah, his late wife. It was unmistakable. "Jose, help me." The whole world stopped for an instant. His heart stopped in his chest. Anna's figure, her image, her voice had disappeared from her life months ago. But now, somehow, she was back. The feeling of terror invaded him completely. Was it possible? How could it be her? "Anna, no, this can't be happening," he said, his voice trembling, feeling his mind fogging up, but still clinging to the idea that it might be a hallucination or some kind of trick. "Jose, please help me, I'm trapped." "I can't get out," Anna's voice told him with palpable desperation. Joseph looked around the room as if expecting to see something, some hint that he was dreaming. Everything was in place. Everything seemed normal. But the feeling that something strange, something dark, was beginning to settle over the house did not leave him calm. The call continued, and his wife's voice did not stop asking for help. Panic began to rise through his chest, choking his breath. I didn't know what to think, what to believe, but I had to do something. "Anna, where are you?" "What's going on?" he asked, almost begging, looking at every corner of the room as if she could appear out of nowhere in front of him. "In the house, replied the voice, which now sounded more distorted, more trembling, as if something were interfering with the communication. Anne's voice died briefly away, and Joseph could hear some strange noises in the background, low noises as if someone is walking through the house. His breathing quickened and his hands began to sweat. Was he listening to what he thought he was hearing? "Who's there?" he asked, almost unable to articulate the words. The response was a low laugh, a deep, malevolent sound that chilled Joseph's blood. It was a laugh that didn't belong to his wife, but to something else, something he couldn't understand, something that had no form. A shiver ran down his spine. The phone began to emit a series of strange sounds as if the call was being interfered with by something else, and then the voice returned, but now it was much deeper, more ominous. "Jose, don't go. Don't go." The warning only intensified the fear in his chest. Something was wrong. Something dark and sinister had taken the place where he had previously lived with Anna. Joseph got out of bed, the phone still pressed to his ear, and with slow steps, began to walk toward the bedroom door. The sound of the ringing of the call, the buzzing on the line, followed as a constant reminder that something was wrong. Every step he took toward the door was a struggle, a battle between the fear that built up inside him and the need to understand what was happening. He sat on the edge of the bed, then got up again, and with trembling hands began to walk down the hall. The house was dark, as it always was at that time of night. Every creak of the floor beneath his feet seemed to resonate as a sign that something was lurking in the shadows. The house, which had once been his home, now seemed a strange and uninhabited place, full of presences that could not be seen, but that were felt in every corner. With the phone still in his hand, Jose approached the lobby and saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A figure was gliding down the dark hallway, a figure he couldn't clearly distinguish but which looked familiar. It seemed to be flowing, as if it wasn't walking but rather gliding. He couldn't see his face, but he felt the presence, as if that figure was watching him. "Anna, is that you?" he said, his voice trembling as if he were looking for some kind of comfort, something that would give meaning to what he was experiencing. The figure paused for a moment and then faded into the darkness. Fear filled Jose's chest, but even with the phone in his hand, he could not take his eyes off the hallway. A loud knock on the front door broke the silence, a sound so loud that it echoed throughout the house. Joseph took a step back, scared, as his mind tried to process everything that was happening. He slowly approached the door, his breathing being the only thing he could hear. When he reached the door, an icy cold ran through his skin, and a shudder shook him completely. He opened the door cautiously, but there was no one on the other side. Nothing, just the cold night wind. He looked back into the house, and that's when he saw him. In the hallway, a face that belonged to someone who couldn't be real. It was not Anna's face or anyone he knew. It was something else, something moving towards him, slowly approaching. The face was pale, lifeless, with eyes that seemed empty, but with an expression of despair. The hair was messy, and the mouth, which moved slowly, uttered words that Joseph could not understand. At that point, the call was abruptly cut off. The phone fell from his hands, and he stepped back, staring in horror at the figure fading into the darkness. The house was quiet again, too much silence, as if everything was suspended in the air, waiting for something else to happen. Joseph, paralyzed by fear, did not know what to do. Was his mind playing a cruel joke on him? Was it a dream? No, what I was experiencing could not be real, but the feeling that something dark had invaded her home was so strong that she couldn't ignore it. He felt a cold presence, the feeling that he was not alone, and at that moment he understood everything. The call, the figure, the voice of Anna. She hadn't been asking for help. She had been a warning. The house was now being occupied by something else, something that should not be there. The door to the hall slammed shut. The lights flickered and went out. Joseph looked around, completely surrounded by darkness. He was no longer alone. When Javier walked into the antique store on a cold winter afternoon, he didn't know his life would never be the same. The air was thick, full of dust and the unmistakable smell of old wood. The store, located in a forgotten corner of the city, seemed like a refuge for everything that had been left behind, for those objects that time had marked, but that still had something of value inside. Every corner was crammed with strange artifacts, broken clocks, opaque mirrors, unusually shaped furniture, and portraits of expressionless faces that seemed to observe the visitor with an eerie calm. Javier had been attracted to the store by a strange sensation, something inexplicable that had pushed him to enter. The owner, an elderly man, sat behind a counter full of more items for sale, his eyes hidden behind thick glasses. He didn't pay much attention to it at first, as his gaze was fixed on an object he couldn't stop staring at. A portrait. The painting was hung on one of the back walls. An ancient portrait of a man with a serious face, but with a penetrating gaze that seemed to follow him even from a distance. The man painted in the picture wore a white linen shirt and a dark hat, and his countenance, though calm, conveyed a sense of uneasiness that could not be ignored. The eyes, dark and deep, stood out with a peculiar intensity. Javier felt a chill run down his spine as he watched them. The shop owner looked at him over his glasses and, in a raspy voice, told him that the painting had belonged to a man with a dark history, a history that the townspeople preferred to forget. He said that no one in his right mind should buy it, but Javier, although bewildered by the old man's words, felt that something inside him was impelling him to take it. Maybe it was the feeling of being able to own something so unique, something with so much history. The old man, seeing that Javier was not going to change his mind, gave him the price, and finally the man took it. When he returned home, Javier hung the portrait on the wall of his living room, right in front of the sofa where he used to spend his nights watching television. At first everything seemed normal, although I couldn't help but feel a strange discomfort every time I looked at the painting. The eyes of the man in the portrait looked like move, but it couldn't be. I was sure I was imagining things. However, that feeling of discomfort grew with each passing day. One night, after a long day at work, Javier sat on his sofa, tired, and saw the portrait once more. This time the feeling was different. The eyes of the man in the painting not only followed him, but stalked him. No matter where he moved in the room, those eyes stared at him. A chill ran through his body as a cold sweat pooled on his forehead. He blinked several times, trying to get the idea out of his head. It couldn't be real. How could it? It was just a painting. But as the night wore on, the presence of those eyes made him feel more and more trapped. As the days went by, Javier began to see things that he could not explain. Sometimes, when he looked at the portrait, the man's eyes seemed to move slightly, as if they were fixed on him. Other times I felt something in the room change, as if the air was charged with a palpable tension. The shadows seemed to be longer than usual, and the noises in the house were intensifying. Creaking walls, barely audible whispers. He woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching him, and when he opened his eyes, all he saw was darkness. But he couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were stalking him even in his dreams. The situation worsened when one night Javier decided to move the portrait to another wall, in an attempt to free himself from the growing sense of anxiety. However, in doing this, something strange happened. As he lifted the painting, a feeling of extreme cold came over him and a dark shadow seemed to cover the place. The eyes of the man in the portrait were staring at him, more intense than ever. At that moment, something changed in the atmosphere of the house. Javier felt an indescribable panic, as if the air itself was pressing on him, as if something invisible was imprisoning him. He couldn't take it anymore and left the portrait on the floor, determined to get rid of it the next day. But that night was the worst of all. Javier woke up with a stabbing pain in his chest, as if someone was pressing his heart. He sat up in bed, looking around, and it was then that he saw something he would never forget. The man in the portrait was standing on the threshold of his room door. His figure was dull, blurred, but his eyes were still the same, those eyes that had haunted him since day one. It was not a dream. It couldn't be. Javier tried to scream, but his voice did not come out. Terror paralyzed him. The man in the portrait began to walk towards him, and with each step, the ground creaked under his weight. Javier tried to move, to get up, but his body did not respond. He was trapped, completely at the mercy of that evil presence that was advancing towards him. The man's eyes shone with a terrifying intensity, as if they had taken on a life of their own, as if they were devouring his soul. At that moment, Javier understood that the portrait was not just a painting. It was a prison, and he was the victim. Suddenly, an invisible force lifted him from the ground and dragged him towards the portrait. He tried to fight, but his strength was fading. The man in the painting watched him unhurriedly while Javier fell to his knees in front of him. At that moment, the air became heavy, almost unbearable, and everything around him began to crumble. The ground beneath his feet disintegrated and the walls faded into darkness. Javier was being absorbed by the painting. In a last-ditch attempt to escape, he managed to turn and see the portrait before being completely consumed. The man in the portrait was looking at him with a satisfied expression, as if he had served his purpose. At that moment, Javier understood that he had been chosen. The portrait had not only stalked him, but had claimed him. The house fell silent. The portrait continued to hang on the wall as if nothing had changed. Nobody knew what had happened to Javier. No one knew that, in that painting, there was now a new look, a new pair of eyes that would follow anyone who dared to observe it, catching the next victim just as it had done with him. The cursed portrait was still waiting in silence, ready to claim whatever was necessary to satisfy his eternal hunger. Night hung over the house with an eerie stillness, silence only interrupted by the occasional sound of a branch hitting the window. Laura was in her living room, embraced by the gloom that filtered through the curtains. The dim light of the table lamp dimly illuminated the book in his hands. In those moments of loneliness, I always found solace in the pages of a good novel, an escape from the daily grind. Tonight, however, something seemed different, something in the air that he couldn't clearly identify. The wall clock struck 9 and Laura heard a noise that broke the tranquility. A soft knock, as if someone were knocking on the door. He got up from the couch and walked toward the entrance, a slight feeling of discomfort running down his back. I never expected visitors at that time. He looked out the window before opening the door, but saw no one. A shiver ran through his body, though he tried to ignore it. After all, it could be children playing or someone in the wrong house. He opened the door and there he was, a man standing in his doorway. He had a serious appearance, with a dark jacket and a hat that partially covered his face. Laura stared at him, bewildered. She didn't recognize him, but there was something in his eyes that seemed strangely familiar. "Good evening," the man said in a deep but calm voice. "Laura, right?" Laura frowned, overwhelmed by a growing sense of unease. "Yes, but I don't know you. How do you know my name?" The man smiled slightly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I told you, Laura. We know each other, even if you don't remember it." Laura blinked, confused. What was he talking about? She had never seen that man in her life. How could I meet her? The air in the room seemed to have become dense, as if the atmosphere itself was being charged with something indescribable. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you," Laura said, trying to remain calm as she took a step back. "I don't know you." The man stood there, motionless, watching her with an uncomfortable intensity. Without saying a word, his eyes flashed for a moment with a strange light. Laura, feeling the weight of the situation, tried to close the door. But before he could, the man stepped forward, preventing him from doing so. "You don't need to be nervous," she said with an eerie calm. "I just want to talk. It's important." Laura's heart began to pound. She didn't understand what was happening, but something inside her was telling her to be alert. The feeling of being watched intensified, and the house, which had once been her refuge, suddenly seemed like a strange alien place. "What do you want?" he asked in a thin voice, trying to stay in control. The man stared at her before answering. "Come with me. There are things you need to remember." A shiver ran down Laura's spine. What things should I remember? The feeling of fear invaded her completely, but at the same time she couldn't help but feel intrigued. Something about the way the man spoke made her feel like she couldn't just refuse him. "I'm going to call the police if you don't leave," he finally said, unable to hide the anxiety in his voice. But the man didn't seem to flinch at the threat. "You can do it if you prefer," he replied with unsettling calmness, "but it won't change anything." Laura felt a growing pressure in her chest. The need to understand what was happening prompted her to take a step back. reluctantly allowing her into her home. The man walked into the room with terrifying naturalness, as if he had been there thousands of times before. "I shouldn't have," Laura muttered to herself, though she knew it was too late. The door closed with a dull sound, and the house was filled with an ominous calm, as if time itself had stopped. The air seemed denser, and the darkness thicker. She sat down on the couch, unable to take her eyes off the man. He sat down in front of her, his arms folded, staring at her. "What I want you to remember is that," he finally said. "Remember what you forgot." Laura frowned, completely bewildered. "I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't know you. Who are you?" The man stared at her, and for an instant, Laura saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. It was as if there was a connection between them, something deep and ancient that I couldn't comprehend. The feeling of dread grew inside him. "I am someone from your past," he replied, his voice deeper. "Someone who knows you better than you think, and something you forgot comes looking for you." Laura didn't understand what was happening, but the man's words echoed in her mind. Something in his tone, in his gaze, caused a feeling of deep terror to take hold of her. A primitive fear, as if something that had been hidden for a long time was about to be revealed. "Leave me alone," he said, rising quickly from the couch. But when she turned to the door, a piercing cry stopped her. "You can't run away from who you are." The scream echoed throughout the house, and at that moment Laura felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. He looked at the man in horror, feeling the air grow even denser, as if his own breath was getting heavier and heavier. "What do you want from me?" he murmured, his voice trembling, unable to comprehend what was happening. The man slowly got up, approaching her unhurriedly, as if he knew there was no escape. "What I want you to remember is that you remember everything you have forgotten." Laura backed away, but the shadows of the house seemed to envelop her, barring any attempt to flee. His heart was pounding, and a cold sweat ran down his forehead. The man looked at her with that same frightful calmness, and at that moment, she understood something that made her blood run cold. She was no longer alone. It was a dark, cold night, with the wind rustling through the branches of the trees, and the lights of the city barely illuminating the distant horizon. The journalist, Samuel Lopez, was prepared for what he hoped would be one more story in his career. He had covered stories of all kinds, from political scandals to crime events, but nothing had prepared him for what he was going to experience that night in the old San Antonio asylum. This place, abandoned more than 3 decades ago, was known in the city for the strange disappearances that occurred at the end of the 70s. For years, it was rumored that patients at the asylum had disappeared without a trace. No one knew what exactly had happened, but the stories circulating spoke of shadows, murmurs in the hallways, and inexplicable presences. Samuel had heard of all these legends, but to him, none of it was anything more than superstitions. He wasn't afraid, but he couldn't deny that something about the atmosphere that night made him uncomfortable. With his flashlight in hand, he advanced through the neglected garden of the asylum. The rusty iron doors creaked as they opened, as if the building itself were waking from a long sleep. Samuel went in, and a shiver ran down his spine. The air was heavy, dense, as if something else was breathing in that place. The empty corridors greeted him with an overwhelming silence, broken only by his own footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden floor. The asylum had an eerie atmosphere, with worn walls, broken windows, and doors that seemed to be waiting to be opened. Every corner of the place was covered in dust, but there was something else, something I couldn't identify. Samuel kept walking, his flashlight illuminating the damp-covered walls. I was looking for something. Evidence, clues, anything that could explain the disappearances. He had read all the available reports, but nothing indicated that there was a clear culprit. What was said was that the patients who disappeared had never been found, and the stories about their last moments varied. But they all agreed that something or someone was behind those disappearances. As he went along, Samuel began to notice something strange. In each corridor he walked, he felt a slight pressure in the air, as if something was watching him. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks due to the natural fear he felt in that place. But soon the sensations became more intense. The sound of his own footsteps began to distort, as if something else was walking beside him, even though no one was around. Suddenly, he stopped in his tracks. His breathing accelerated and his heart began to pound. In the darkness, something was moving, A soft, almost imperceptible whisper reached his ear, something like a, "Go away." But when he turned to look, there was nothing. The flashlight trembled in his hand, but his mind remained steady. He told himself that he must continue, that he was an experienced journalist and that nothing could scare him. However, as he made his way through the corridors of the asylum, things began to get worse. The air grew denser and darkness closed in around him. Every time he turned a corner, he felt that something was following him, something sliding behind him, barely perceptible. Each creak of the building seemed more ominous, and the echo of his footsteps was now mingled with inaudible whispers coming from all directions. In one of the rooms he found, an old wooden door opened with a low creak. Samuel pushed her cautiously and went inside. The room was empty, but in one of the corners there was an abandoned wheelchair covered in dust and cobwebs. On an impulse, Samuel approached her, moving her slightly. It was then that he saw it. A shadow, dark and elongated, slid down the wall, moving rapidly. Samuel watched her, paralyzed. It wasn't a shadow cast by his flashlight, but something else, something he couldn't identify, but which filled him with a visceral terror. A shudder ran through his body. The air seemed to become even heavier, and a pressure in his chest made him breathe heavily. The feeling of being watched intensified. He turned toward the door, but it slammed shut, echoing throughout the building. Samuel tried to open it, but it was locked. Something or someone was catching him in that place. Suddenly he heard footsteps behind him, soft but steady, getting closer and closer. He turned around, but there was nothing. Only the darkness and his breath that resounded in his ears. However, the steps continued. The sound was clear and close. It was not his imagination. Something was following him, something moving with him, adjusting to his movements, waiting for the right moment to catch him. Fear began to take hold of him, and for a moment he thought about giving up, about running away, but something kept him there, an invisible force that kept him anchored to that place. Suddenly a soft, raspy voice whispered in his ear, as if coming from deep within the asylum. "We know what you fear, what you have come for. You can't escape us." Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. The voice was charged with indescribable evil, and it made his skin crawl. It was as if the very walls of the asylum were speaking to him, as if the whole building had a life of its own. With his eyes bulging, Samuel began to run, banging on the walls and opening doors desperately. The corridor seemed to lengthen endlessly, and the doors he was trying to open were closed. The building wouldn't let him escape, as if he had absolute control over it. The footsteps continued to echo in his back, getting closer and closer, until a cold sweat covered his forehead. Reaching a staircase at the end of the hallway, Samuel hurried upstairs, but something stopped him. A shudder ran through her body as she noticed that the shadows around her seemed to lengthen and take shapes, human figures, but distorted, deformed, as if the souls of the missing patients had been trapped in the asylum. The shadows stretched towards him, his invisible arms trying to touch him, to grab him. A cold hand touched his shoulder. Samuel screamed, but no sound came out of his mouth. He turned quickly, finding himself face to face with a pale figure, empty-eyed and a face twisted with suffering. The figure smiled, and its lips slowly parted, revealing a row of sharp teeth. Fear paralyzed Samuel. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. He could only watch as the figure watched him, as if he was devouring him with his gaze. "You're in our house now," the figure whispered in a deep, guttural voice, "and you can never leave." The darkness enveloped him completely, and Samuel disappeared into the shadows like all the others before him. The next day, journalists and police arrived at the asylum after receiving an anonymous call. They found his recording equipment on the ground intact, but Samuel had disappeared without a trace. There were no signs of a fight, or that he had fled. All that remained was the feeling that something terrible had happened that night, and that the entity that inhabited the asylum was still there, waiting for its next victim. Samuel Lopez was never spoken of again, but those who dare to approach the doors of the San Antonio asylum claim to hear the footsteps of someone else walking in the shadows. The small village of San Esteban, nestled in the mountains and surrounded by the thick forest, seemed a quiet place. The stone houses, the red-tiled roofs, and the cobbled streets gave a feeling of serenity, almost from another time. However, beneath that apparent calm, something dark and fearsome had stalked its inhabitants since time immemorial. Every evening, when the sun began to hide behind the trees and the cool night air began to fill the streets, A bell rang in the village church. It was not a normal bell. Its sound did not announce the time, nor did it call for prayer. Every time the bell rang in the air, someone in the village died. No one knew how or why, but everyone knew that the sound was an omen. A death was about to come. The bell was the soul of the people, the dark conscience that kept the balance of fear. The villagers knew this, and though superstition had plagued them for generations, none could escape the unease of hearing its chime. The bell, with its deep, dull sound, was a sentence, and everyone lived under its shadow. Among the inhabitants of San Esteban, no one dared to ask too much. No one wanted to investigate the origins of the bell, for it had always been said that anyone who tried would meet an even more gruesome death. However, that apparent tranquility, the resigned acceptance of fate, was going to be upset one autumn afternoon. That afternoon, the town was full of rumors. The bell had rung louder than usual. No one remembered hearing such a brutal ringing or so often. For some, the sound was so heartbreaking that houses shook. One woman, Araceli, felt the air thicken, as if the atmosphere itself was saturated with something more than fear. His hands twitched as he heard the deep vibration of the metal. His mother, who had always been very superstitious, had told him stories about the bell. He had always said that sound was a reflection of what would happen, and that the louder it was heard, the more imminent death was. That same night, when the shadows were already lengthening in the streets and the trees were rustling in the wind, Araceli walked home, quickening her pace. At first he thought it was his mind playing tricks, but as he approached the edge of the village, he saw a stooped figure, standing, looking toward the church. He was a man of the people, Javier, known for his solitary character. His face was distorted, his eyes fixed on the horizon, unable to look away. "Javier," Araceli called him. "Are you okay?" The man did not react. He didn't seem to hear her. Then a shudder ran through Araceli's body when she heard again the bell ringing. It was a long, deep sound that seemed to resonate in his bones. It was the harbinger of death. Javier's figure began to move slowly as if he were shedding an invisible weight, and with each step he took, his eyes seemed to lose their focus. Darkness enveloped him. Araceli, horrified, approached cautiously. It was then that he saw Javier's hand tremble in the air, as if he were looking for something that did not exist. Javier's scream was the last thing Araceli heard before the bell rang again. Once again the bell rose, and with its echo, death took its form. Javier fell to the ground like a broken wrist as his body began to be claimed by the darkness. Someone had died, and the people, as always, did not know how or why. From that night on, things began to change. People began to see shadows they couldn't explain, murmurs that crossed the streets in silence. No one could be sure they were safe. The inhabitants of San Esteban knew that when the bell rang, death was near, but they never expected that this closeness would become more palpable than ever. Every time the bell rang, someone disappeared. Children no longer played in the streets in the evening. Adults were rushing to close their doors and windows. No one wanted to be next. No one could predict who would be the next to fall. The bell resounded so loudly that it felt as if its echo pierced the bones. There was no peace. There was no hope. People started talking. Some said that the bell had been cursed since its creation. Others believed that someone from deep within the church had invoked a dark force to punish the people. The most superstitious said that the bell would only be silent when all the inhabitants of San Esteban were dead, one by one. And as if it were a sign, a new wave of panic quickly spread through the village. Some tried to flee, but those who did never returned. The roads around St. Stephen's seemed to close behind them, as if an invisible veil separated them from the outside world. People who ventured too far did not return, and those who did were empty-eyed, as if they had seen something that could not be explained. Finally, a group of brave people decided to face the unknown. They went inside the church to investigate the origin of the bell. Araceli, distraught but determined, joined the group, wanting to understand what was happening. They couldn't sit idly by while death took away more and more people. What they found inside the church was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The bell, suspended in the air, seemed to radiate a dark energy, as if it were alive. No one dared to approach. The bell, its metal blackened by the passage of time, vibrated gently. The walls of the church creaked as if something was about to break. The clocks of the church, without any explanation, marked the exact same time, the hour of death. At that moment, Araceli felt a presence behind her. He turned quickly, but all he could see was an imposing shadow, a masked figure emerging from the darkness. The bell, now fully resonant, emitted a thunderous sound that made the ground beneath his feet tremble. One by one, the brave ones fell, as if the air itself had become poisonous. Araceli was the last to be left standing. As the echo of the bell echoed in his chest, he realized that death was not something that could be avoided, that the bell was not a mere instrument of warning, but the very face of death. The figure that had stalked her, the shadow that had watched her for so long, slowly approached. "It's too late for everyone, child," whispered the shadow. Before Araceli could react, the bell rang for the last time. A shudder ran through her body, and an unsettling peace enveloped her. The last bell rang in the air, and with it, the fate of San Esteban was sealed. Death had claimed everyone. The campaign stopped, and everything was silent. The village had been consumed, and there was no trace of its inhabitants. The church was in ruins, the bell no longer sounded. But in the fog that surrounded the town, its echo seemed to continue to resound. The town of San Esteban disappeared, but its history was never forgotten. The echo of the bell was still alive, waiting for the next victim, the next soul that crossed its path. Thus ended the last bell. St. Bryce's University had witnessed hundreds of stories, from the early days of its founding to the modern era. Its Gothic architecture, with its towering towers and dark corridors, inspired both respect and fear. No one really knew every corner of campus. The oldest spoke of forgotten corridors, locked doors, and underground passages that led to places that should never be discovered. Thomas, a young history student, had heard many of these stories in the hallways, whispered quietly by his older classmates. Like many others, he considered them mere legends, nothing more than ghost tales that served to scare new ones. But there was something different about him, an insatiable curiosity to unveil the secrets of the past. So when he came across an old key in a dusty corner of the library one day, he couldn't help but be drawn to it. The key looked old, as if it belonged to an object forgotten centuries ago. No one seemed to recognize her, and this only added to the mystery surrounding her. That afternoon, as he walked around campus, his mind kept spinning over that key. He felt a strange connection to her, as if something was calling him. It was then that, while walking near the east side of the university, he noticed something peculiar, a small corridor that he had never seen before. Although he knew every corner of the place well, it seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. The walls covered in ivy and mold, and the dim light that filtered through the broken windows made it seem like a place lost in time. Deep within that hallway, the atmosphere felt dense, as if the air itself was charged with dark energy. Tomas's heart was pounding as he walked down the hallway, key in hand, as if he'd been waiting all his time to get to that place. His footsteps echoed on the stone floor, and the echo seemed to follow him as if the corridor were alive and watching. At the end of the corridor, a solid wooden door, covered with dust and cobwebs, stood before him. Something inside him knew that was where he should use the key. As he inserted the key into the lock, a strange whisper rose into the air, almost inaudible at first, but growing with each turn of the key. It was as if someone was whispering his name, calling to him from beyond the door. Sweat began to trickle down his forehead as the door slowly opened, revealing a dark room, a room that had been closed for generations. As he crossed the threshold, Thomas was overcome by a sensation of intense cold, which ran down his spine and froze his bones. The walls were covered with strange symbols which seemed to move as he watched them. The air in the room was dense, as if the atmosphere itself was polluted by something ancient, something that had been waiting a long time to be discovered. In the distance, in the center of the room, an old wooden table was surrounded by broken chairs, and on the table a closed book seemed to be waiting for him. Thomas cautiously approached the book, feeling the weight of the story and the mystery that surrounded it. With trembling hands, he opened the book, only to find pages covered in red ink, as if they had been written in blood. The words in the book did not seem to form coherent sentences, but were fragments that spoke of rituals, of dark pacts, and of a presence that lived in the halls of the university, waiting for the right moment to reclaim those who dared to discover its existence. As he read, a strange feeling of dizziness came over him. Whispers that had previously been barely perceptible were now clearly audible. Voices coming from everywhere, but I couldn't identify where they came from. The voices called him by name, whispering promises and warnings. He felt as if something was watching him from the shadows, as if something was waiting for him to make a mistake, something that could condemn him. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out. The corridor behind him seemed to have lengthened, and the door through which he had entered was no longer visible. He saw only darkness, a black chasm expanding before him. At that instant, a loud noise made him spin. Something was moving quickly towards him, a whisper that transformed into a guttural, inhuman scream full of rage. Fear invaded him completely, but he could not move. He was paralyzed, trapped in a labyrinth of darkness and terror. Cold fingers landed on his shoulder, and his body reacted immediately, giving him a shudder that made him take a step back. He turned, but no one was there. Just the echo of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. However, the air was charged with an invisible presence surrounding him. The voices intensified, and they began to speak in a language that he did not understand, but that resonated deep within his being. His eyes widened as the figure of a woman appeared in front of him, her face haggard, her eyes empty of emotion, but filled with infinite sadness. Thomas tried to scream, but his throat didn't respond, as if something was choking him from the inside. The woman began to walk towards him, and with every step she took, the ground shook slightly. When he was in front of him, his lips moved slowly, but the words did not reach his ear. It was not a human language, but something more primitive, something that belonged to a lost age. Suddenly, Thomas felt a pressure on his chest, as if the air itself was crushing him. The woman stretched out her hand towards him, and at that instant the lights came back on, but the room was completely transformed. I was no longer in the dark and dusty place, but in an ethereal space outside of time, where everything looked distorted, as if the world itself was broken. It was as if he had been transported to a place that did not belong to reality. The voices surrounded him, and now he could see them. Shadows of human figures, all with the same empty and sad expressions, all whispering but not saying anything he could understand. The shadows closed in on him, and as they surrounded him, an excruciating pressure took over his mind. He wanted to scream, but the words choked in his throat. Finally, the woman spoke, and this time her words were clear, though filled with overwhelming darkness. The corridor is alive. It always has been. All those who have crossed its doors have been claimed. And now, it's your turn. Panic took hold of him, but he couldn't move. The darkness surrounded him, and the voices called to him, full of despair, of pain. The hallway had been created to trap curious souls, to keep them trapped in an endless cycle. And now Thomas had become part of that cycle. The woman, now a shadowy figure, looked at him with infinite sadness, as if she were sorry. The hallway was never a physical place. It was a threshold, a line between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and once crossed, there was no turning back. Tomas never returned. The whispering hall closed behind him, and the voices died away, leaving only the echo of his lost existence. The mystery of St. Bryce's University continued, and the legends about the forgotten corridor grew more somber. No one else dared to look for that hallway, but those passing by swore they heard whispers, as if the hallway was waiting for the next victim. The icy wind was blowing against the windows of the train. The darkness was absolute, like a blanket that covered the vastness of the landscape. No one was on board except her. A woman with a pale face and restless eyes, sitting on an empty seat, was looking out the window, looking for something in the nothingness that could give her an answer. Her name was Clara, and she had taken the train for reasons she could hardly remember. A call in the early morning, an urgent warning that had dragged her on this endless journey. It didn't matter that it was late or that the train was so strange. His destiny seemed unshakable. The train moved forward without stopping, through a desolate and gloomy landscape. The trees seemed to die in their wake, their shadows spreading like specters crawling over the frozen ground. The only light was the dim light that came from the train lamps, creating more shadows than light. Clara couldn't take her eyes off the window. Sometimes I thought I saw figures moving in the dark, but when I looked again, nothing was there. She thought that maybe fatigue was starting to get to her, that the endless hours on the train were confusing her. The sound of the train was constant, like a dull murmur, accompanied by the creaking of the rails that seemed to intensify as time passed. Across the aisle, Clara observed the closed doors of the carriages. Something in the air had changed, but he didn't know what. The feeling of being watched took hold of her. He got up from his seat with effort, his legs trembling from the lack of movement. He slowly walked down the hallway, his breathing getting heavier as he neared the end of the train. When she reached the last door, she tried to open it, but something stopped her. A cold, inexplicable hand rested on his shoulder. Clara turned quickly, her heart leaping from her chest, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. However, the feeling of being accompanied by something or someone was still present, persistent and overwhelming. With a trembling sigh, he opened the door of the last carriage. The scene that unfolded before her was completely different from what she had seen in the previous carriages. Instead of empty seats and metal walls, the atmosphere became thick, as if the air was charged with dense energy. The carriage looked older, the timbers worn, the walls covered in mold. The train was no longer moving, but it was not stopping either. It was suspended in time. A shiver ran down his spine. Clara stepped back, and at that moment she heard a faint sound like a whisper coming from the shadows. Something was calling to her, something she couldn't see but felt deeply. Cautiously, he walked toward the center of the carriage, his footsteps echoing strangely, as if the sound were muffled by the invisible mist that filled the air. Suddenly the voice appeared. It was not a human voice, but a distant muffled whisper, as if someone were speaking from the bottom of an abyss. "Don't go," the voice whispered. "You can't leave." Clara took a step back, her body stiff with fear. The whisper seemed to envelop her, filling every corner of her mind. Faces began to materialize around him, ethereal figures emerging from the shadows. Some of them looked human, but their empty eyes and disfigured faces made it clear that they weren't. Others were just shadowy silhouettes without a defined form, but with a presence so overwhelming that the air itself became dense and heavy. What is this?" murmured Clara, trying to find her voice in the midst of the chaos. The atmosphere was getting thicker and thicker, as if something invisible was pressing on it, crushing it. The figures began to move, gliding towards her with terrifying slowness. "We can't rest," said one figure, his voice hoarse and broken. "The train never stops for us. We're trapped just like you." Clara tried to take a step back, but her feet did not respond. She felt as if the ground was swallowing her shoes, as if every movement was a struggle against an invisible force that held her prisoner. The figures around him whispered, repeating words he couldn't understand. And then a different voice, clearer and full of despair, spun her quickly. "Help me!" shouted an approaching figure. Clara could make out the features of a woman, her face contorted with pain and anguish. "Don't leave me here. Don't go, please." But before Clara could answer, the woman disappeared, vanishing like a mist. The air became even colder, and the presence of the spirits began to surround her, getting closer and closer. Clara felt the weight of his gaze, the weight of his untold stories. The train was still not moving, but time no longer seemed to exist. Nothing moved outside the car, just a perpetual void that stretched into nothingness. At that moment, Clara realized the worst. She was also a prisoner. The train never stopped, never got anywhere. She was also trapped in that suspended space between the past and the future, between life and death. The voices intensified, the whisper of trapped souls surrounded her. "Why don't you leave?" A shadow murmured in front of her. "We couldn't, but you can still get out." But Clara didn't know if there was still anything left out. She didn't know if there was anything beyond the train, beyond the station where she was now trapped. Was she dead? Was she alive? The faces of the dead watched her, waiting for an answer that she herself did not have. Fear invaded her, terror began to consume her, but something inside her told her that there was a way out, a way to escape. "Let me out," shouted Clara, her voice cracking with panic. "Let me go." The shadows came closer, touching his skin with cold hands. "You can't leave," they said in unison. "The train never ends. Time does not advance for us, but there's something you can do." Clara looked at them, her eyes full of tears, her heart pounding. "What do I have to do?" he asked in a trembling voice. One of the figures, that of the desperate woman, approached her. "You have to decide. Stay and be one of us, or move on and break the cycle. But you'll never be free without making that choice." The sound of the train began to change. It was no longer the constant rumbling of the rails. Now there was a soft sound, like the rustling of fallen leaves. The station seemed to crumble around her, as if the walls of the train were beginning to fade. "Choose quickly," said another shadow, his voice broken and anguished. "The train is stopping. You'll never have this opportunity again." Clara, her heart racing, looked around. Shadows clustered around her, reaching out their hands toward her soul. Time seemed to dilate and compress at the same time. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay there. He couldn't become one of them. I needed to get out. Suddenly, the train stopped. A deep silence invaded the space. The darkness around him slowly dissolved, and Clara found herself back at the station, the fresh air beating down on her face. She was no longer alone. The shadows, the ghosts had vanished, and the station had ceased to exist. The train had come to an end, but Clara had also left the last station behind. She wasn't trapped, and though terror had been his companion all this time, he now understood that he had chosen freedom. No matter what came next, she had decided to continue, and with that decision, the train and the fear disappeared forever. Ever since he moved into the old apartment building, Javier had felt a strange presence. It wasn't something tangible, but a nagging sense of being watched. The building, with its narrow corridors and mold on the walls, seemed to have a life of its own. However, what worried him most was not the age of the place, or even the strange noises during the night. What really disturbed him was the absolute silence during the day, as if the building was waiting for something or someone. When Javier signed the contract, he was excited. He had been looking for a place where he could live alone, a refuge where he could focus on his work and be away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The price was incredibly low, almost too good to be true, but the realtor, an older man with a serious look, assured him that there would be no problem. However, he did not tell her everything. The first night was quiet until something strange happened. Javier woke up in the middle of the night, startled by a feeling of discomfort. I felt like something wasn't right, but I couldn't identify what it was. The air in his apartment was heavy, dense, as if someone was standing in the same room watching him. At first he thought it was darkness playing tricks with his mind, but when he looked down the hall, he could swear that he saw a slowly moving shadow. It wasn't the first time she'd moved. I had been to several places before, and I had never experienced anything like it. Even though I was used to moving and living in new places, something about this apartment seemed different. The air was charged with an energy that kept him alert, a heavy energy, as if something was trapped in that place and couldn't escape. At first, Javier tried to ignore him. He thought it was his mind, perhaps too tired from the stress of moving and adjusting to his new routine. But as the days passed, the feelings of discomfort only got worse. Every time he found himself in the hallway, he felt something following him. But when he looked back, there was nothing. It took several weeks before he decided to investigate the apartment's past. The realtor hadn't told her much about the previous tenants, only that the unit had been empty for several months. Javier felt that he needed to know more, as if that knowledge could help him understand why he felt that he was not alone. It was then that he met the neighbor of the apartment next door, a middle-aged woman named Mariana. She was sitting in the doorway, apparently waiting for someone to come by. Javier, with his natural curiosity, approached and struck up a conversation. "Do you know anything about apartment 304? He asked, pointing to her door. Mariana stared at him for a few seconds before answering. Something in his eyes didn't seem to want to talk about it, but finally, he sighed. "That place, he's not like the others," he said quietly. "The last tenant disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to him, but the building was never the same after that." Javier frowned, confused. "Did it disappear? How? What do you mean he was never the same?" Mariana looked at him again, this time more cautiously. "That person never came back. It wasn't a simple abandonment, you understand? It was as if it had vanished. And after that, strange things started to happen. People have stopped living there. They have had experiences. Nobody wants to talk about it, but maybe you should leave before something happens to you." Javier felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know if what Mariana was saying to him was a joke, a superstition, or something more serious. However, he couldn't ignore the lingering feeling he had since moving in. It was as if the apartment was imbued with a dark energy that constantly surrounded him. That night, as he was getting ready for sleep, he heard a soft whisper coming from the hallway. It was almost inaudible, but enough to startle him. I didn't understand where it came from, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Mariana had said. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if something was waiting outside his door, waiting to enter. Determined to find out the truth, Javier began to investigate more about the apartment. In the building manager's office, he gained access to the old records. There he found an entrance that mentioned the last tenant of 304, a man named Ivan Paredes. According to records, Ivan had been an ordinary man with no criminal record, someone who had lived in the building for nearly 2 years before disappearing without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle in his apartment. There was nothing to indicate that something had gone wrong, except for the nagging feeling that something had vanished. No one in the building seemed to know more, but Javier could sense that there was something dark hiding, something he couldn't fully comprehend. As the days passed, the presence in the apartment became more intense. Every night, Javier woke up with the feeling that someone was in his room, standing next to his bed, watching him in silence. At times, he felt cold breathing on his face, and when he turned around, he found no one. The shadows seemed to move along the walls, twisting and changing shape as if they were taking on a life of their own. The straw that broke the camel's back was when, one night, Javier woke up to find his mirror fogged up, but with something written on it. The letters seemed to form slowly, as if something invisible was writing the words in the cold mist of the glass. "I'm looking at you," he said. Fear took hold of him, and he knew he could no longer ignore it. It was as if Ivan, the former tenant, had never left the place. Something in his spirit had been trapped, doomed to wander around the apartment looking for a way to communicate. Javier tried to seek help, but all efforts were in vain. No one in the building seemed willing to talk openly about what was going on there. Mariana refused to say more, and the other neighbors simply walked away as if afraid to face the truth. Javier tried to do everything he could to flee from the presence, but he was trapped. One day, when he entered his apartment, the door slammed shut behind him and the light went out. It was completely dark, unable to move or find a way out. He felt a pressure in his chest, as if someone was choking him, and then he heard a voice, soft but clear, whispering in his ear, "I'm waiting for you." The door slammed open, and Javier ran out of the apartment, trembling with terror. He knew that something in the apartment would not let him go. It had been an illusion to think that he could escape the curse that had taken over the place. Fear would haunt him forever. The spirit of the last tenant, Ivan, would never leave him. Somehow, Javier had now become part of the cycle, and the apartment would follow him, trap him in its web. It didn't matter how far it went. The darkness would always find its way to him, and there would be no escape. The last tenant was not just a story of a lost spirit, but of a far more powerful force, something that transcended death and life itself, something that could never be forgotten. The antique shop was hidden in a narrow, dusty street, almost impossible to find if you didn't know exactly where to look. The display cases were full of dusty objects, old and forgotten in appearance, which had survived the passage of time without being appreciated, destined to fall into the oblivion of future generations. However, in the midst of the darkness of that store, there was a piece that seemed to glow with a subtle yet unsettling glow. Gabriel, a young art collector, had come to the shop after hearing rumors about an old painting that was said to have an intriguing history. The owner of the shop, an older man with an enigmatic look, received him in silence and led him to the back, where, on an easel, was the painting that had attracted Gabriel's attention. It was a medium-sized painting, with a scene showing a family gathered around a table. The painting was beautiful, with impeccable technique, but there was something about people's faces that I couldn't decipher. Something in those empty eyes and that frozen expression troubled him deeply. The background was gloomy, as if a thick dark fog was sliding across the scene, enveloping everything in an air of despair. Gabriel couldn't help but feel a strange attraction to painting. Although his friends and colleagues at the art gallery warned him, something inside him told him that the piece should be his. The price asked by the old owner seemed derisory for a work of such quality, and despite the old man's non-verbal warning, Gabriel did not hesitate to make the purchase. Once at home, the painting was carefully placed on the main wall of the living room, right in front of the fireplace. That same night after dinner, Gabriel sat in front of the painting, observing the details, trying to understand what made the work unsettling about it. The image attracted him, enveloped him, as if the painted figures were trying to speak to him, to call him to something beyond the canvas. The first change occurred during the early morning, when moonlight filtered through the windows and reflected on the canvas. Gabriel, still awake, stood up at the sound of a slight creak, as if the painting itself were moving. He looked up at the wall where the paint seemed to have changed slightly. The figures in the painting were no longer in the same posture. The woman who was sitting on the right of the table, smiling at the painting, now seemed to be staring at Gabriel, His eyes had become darker, deeper, as if that woman's gaze was watching him directly through the painting. A shiver ran down Gabriel's spine. He tried to rationalize what he had seen, thinking that perhaps the light and shadow played tricks on his eyes. But as the days went by, the alterations in the painting became more noticeable. Every night the scene was modified, albeit in a subtle way. The faces in the painting were beginning to show more distressed expressions. The figure of the man in the center, which at first seemed a reassuring figure, began to distort. His face lengthened, as if the painting were taking on a life of its own. Gabriel began to notice that, even though the figures seemed inert during the day, every time he turned off the lights, the eyes of the characters in the painting seemed to move towards him. One night, while studying the painting, something even stranger happened. The scene was completely altered. The painting family was no longer gathered around the table. Instead, the characters seemed to be facing each other, their faces disfigured by terror. The man in the center of the table seemed to be screaming, but he made no sound. The figures were surrounded by a thick fog, as if the painting itself was being swallowed by something dark and ominous. Gabriel felt trapped in a nightmare. He began to see shadowy figures reflected on the surface of the canvas. I couldn't take my eyes off the painting, but at the same time I felt a growing sense of anguish. He decided to research the history of the painting, looking for any clue as to its origin. However, what he found only plunged him further into mystery. There were no records of that work, nor of the family portrayed in it. The only thing he could find was a hidden note on the back of the painting that read, "Darkness takes away what it touches." This note, written in an ancient calligraphy, appeared to be marked with a red stain, as if it were blood. One afternoon, when returning from work, Gabriel found the painting completely changed. The scene had advanced. Now it showed the characters in what seemed an even more disturbing scenario. A fire was burning behind the family, consuming the scene in total chaos. The woman's figure, which at first seemed to be the calmer figure, was now wide-eyed, her hands raised as if trying to scream, but not audibly. Gabriel was indescribably attracted to painting, but at the same time an unbearable terror seized him. One night, as I was looking at the painting through a dim light, something worse happened. The figures began to move in the painting. The woman on the right, the one who originally looked so calm, slowly raised her hand to the surface of the painting. Gabriel took a step back, trembling. A shrill scream echoed through his head, a sound of despair and pain. Suddenly, the woman's figure began to slowly fade away, as if she was being absorbed by the fire at the bottom. Every time I looked at the painting, something else changed, something creepier. The characters were no longer only horrified, but seemed to be suffering, as if the painting was taking their lives. Gabriel began to feel a presence, something that slipped behind him, watching him as he looked at the painting. I couldn't escape that feeling that I wasn't alone. Then something even more terrifying happened. During one of his sleepless nights, Gabriel woke up with a feeling of tightness in his chest. He looked at the painting and saw something he had never imagined. One of the figures in the painting, the man sitting at the table, had disappeared. Instead, he was himself staring from the canvas. The painting had captured him. Terror seized him. Gabriel tried to move away, but his eyes could not stop looking at the painting. The man in the painting, now with his face distorted, began to slowly move towards the edge of the painting, as if he was trying to break through the canvas. Gabriel jumped up, but the figures began to lengthen and twist, emitting whispers that echoed in his mind. The worst of all was when one of the figures began to call him by his name. Gabriel heard clearly the whisper of his own voice emerging from the painting. "Gabriel, come here." The feeling of despair completely invaded him. His mind became cloudy, and fear consumed him. He ran to the door, but when he tried to open it, the painting seemed to come to life. His eyes full of terror looked at him, and he felt that he was being pursued. The figure of the man in the painting, now with a macabre grin, began to stretch towards him, as if trying to reach for him. Gabriel could not escape that oppressive atmosphere. The man in the painting drew nearer and nearer until, with a last cry, he disappeared from the canvas, leaving only the dense fog that enveloped the scene. Suddenly, everything in the room went dark. Painting was no longer just an image on the canvas. Gabriel could no longer distinguish between the real world and the painting, as if the painting had completely absorbed him. Fear, terror, and despair surrounded him, as he watched the scene of the painting slowly unravel, taking with it the only reality he knew. The painting had served its purpose. The house stood lonely, surrounded by trees that seemed to whisper to each other with each gust of wind. Its facade, aged by the passage of time, crumbled to one side, but its structure remained imposing, like a shadow that hid forgotten stories. For Laura and her family, this place represented a new opportunity, a fresh start after years of hardship. They moved without much thought, attracted by the apparent tranquility of the countryside and the promise of a home that could offer them peace. It was a rainy Monday when they arrived, the water pounding against the windows furiously, but nothing seemed to break the solemn atmosphere around them. The mother, Laura, watched nervously as her children, Alan and Sophia, ran around the house exploring every corner while she organized the first boxes. The air smelled of old wood, but despite the humidity that permeated everything, the house seemed to have a presence of its own, something that could never be ignored. The first hours passed without any notable incident. The children laughed and Laura tried to organize the kitchen, which was larger than she had imagined. But soon they began to notice something strange. The echoes. At first they thought it was part of the place, that the old walls amplified the sounds. But the truth was much more terrifying. It all started when Laura called her children for dinner. "Alan, Sophia, dinner is ready," he shouted from the hallway. But what he answered was not the voice of his son or daughter, but a deep, guttural voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Laura," the voice whispered, but it wasn't she who was listening to it. It was an alien voice, deep, ancient, that slipped through the house like a shadow. Laura thought it was a joke, but her children's eyes widened when they heard the answer. "Did you hear that?" asked Alan blankly. Laura tried to calm the children, assuring them that it was just the sound of the house, but as the days passed, the echoes began to become more persistent. At first, the voices only repeated what was being said, but soon they began to alter the words. "Laura, look for what you forgot," he whispered once, while Laura, alone in the library, turned slowly at the bewildering message. What had I forgotten? I couldn't remember. The echoes began to take on a more tangible form, as if the voices could see something she didn't. As she explored the house, she found old photos in the attic, faded images of people she didn't know. One of the portraits caught his attention, a man with a grim expression looking toward the camera with eyes full of despair. The house had secrets, and the echoes were just the beginning. One night, while the family was having dinner in the dining room, Sophia asked something that made the air freeze. "Mom, who is the man in the attic photo?" he asked innocently. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't mentioned anything about the photo. "What man?" he muttered, but before he could ask, the voice of the man in the photo spoke in the dining room. "Look at what you're hiding." Panic gripped Laura, but she still tried to rationalize what was happening. The voices were echoes, nothing more than that. But every time someone spoke, the echoes responded, and over time they began to reveal darker secrets. The man in the photo, the voice whispering in the night, began to put together pieces of a strange puzzle. That house had not only been his refuge, but also his prison. Laura began to investigate the history of the house, but the more she investigated, the more terrifying the revelation became. The house had originally been built by a man named Samuel, a hermit who had disappeared without a trace, but not before he had committed terrible acts. He had used the house as a refuge for those he had recruited from other nearby villages. No one knew for sure what was going on within the walls of the mansion, but the echoes, the whispers of those who had passed by, had never been extinguished. One night, while Laura was sleeping in her room, something strange happened. The echoes grew louder and louder, more intense until they began to transform into heart-rending screams. "Help, help me!" shouted a female voice, and Laura woke up breathing heavily. He got out of bed trembling and walked down the hall. In the mirror at the entrance, she saw her reflection, but she was not alone. Someone else was there, a shadow that vanished before he could scream. That same night, Alan and Sophia began to have nightmares. They woke up sobbing, terrified by the voices that spoke to them from the walls. "We are here with you," whispered the voices, as if they were trapped in the place. It wasn't just a game. It wasn't just an old house. They were trapped in something much bigger, something darker. Anxiety was building up in Laura. As the days went by, the echoes began to reveal more personal, deeper things. "Your mother is in danger," the voices whispered to Sophia, and then to Alan before they could tell Laura. Something was crumbling in the walls and she could feel it. One day, Laura returned to the attic and found something that left her cold. A small old leather notebook, full of words written in dark ink. The words were written in a hurried manner, with palpable desperation. It was Samuel's story, but it was also his family's. He had invoked a dark covenant, one that bound him to the house forever, and to all those who moved there. He had used his own children. He had done horrible things to them, and the echoes were their trapped souls doomed to repeat their cries eternally. Laura tried to destroy the notebook, burn it, but the echoes increased in intensity, and the voices began to scream louder. "You can't escape," said the voices, ringing in their ears, filled with hatred and despair. When she tried to flee with her children, Laura realized that the house would not let them leave. The doors slammed shut, the windows were tightly sealed, and echoes filled every corner. At that moment, the family understood the truth. The echoes were not only voices that responded to what they said. They were voices that revealed what had happened in the house, the sins committed by those who had lived there before. And now the family was caught in that same curse. Laura, in her desperation, tried to remember everything she had learned about the house, about the pact that had bound souls to those walls. But there was no way out. The voices increased in intensity, filling the house with a deafening roar. "They're here to stay," the final voice rang out, and with one last cry of terror, Laura and her family joined the echoes. The House of Echoes had claimed its last victim, and the voices continued to repeat their secrets, eternally trapped in the walls of that forgotten mansion. The icy desert wind blew hard, pushing the sand dunes into the darkest corners of the earth. The expedition of archaeologists had reached the end of their search, but none of them was prepared for what was about to be discovered. The mist kicked up by the wind hid what looked like a giant rock, but as it approached, a peculiar shape began to emerge before the team's eyes. Something buried, but visible, as if it were waiting to be found. The lead archaeologist, Marco Ruiz, was a man of great experience, but even he felt uncomfortable seeing that hidden tomb. It was unlike anything he had encountered in his career. The stone was marked by an inscription in an ancient language, one that he could not decipher but which somehow seemed to him close. The lines of the inscription formed enigmatic patterns that seemed to move, as if they took on a life of their own with the light of the lanterns. This is not in any of the registers," Marco said, his voice trembling with fascination and unease. "This is something we've never seen before." The team began digging around the tomb. No one questioned what they felt because they were all too engrossed in the wonder of the find. But something in the air began to change, an invisible tension enveloping them as they dug up the lid of the tomb. The shadow seemed to lengthen with each blow, and the air grew thicker. However, the most terrifying moment came when finally, after hours of work, the sarcophagus was uncovered. When he opened it, a thick mist shot out from inside the tomb. It was a cold, almost gelatinous air that permeated his lungs instantly. None of them had ever seen anything like it before. Marco, driven by his own curiosity, reached out and touched the object that rested inside the tomb. Instantly, a wave of vision swept over him. The visions. The vision dragged him into total darkness. In the middle of it, there was an ancient and devastated city. The streets were empty, desolate, covered with dust. There were distant screams, murmurs echoing from the crumbling walls. Marco could not understand what he saw, but terror invaded him. He saw figures crawling among the ruins, diffuse shadows, as if they were beings caught in an endless cycle. Suddenly, one of those shadows approached him. The form was human, but with the skin covered in scars that seemed to be alive, pulsating as if something inside it was struggling to come out. His eyes were two pits of darkness, and a raspy voice murmured something that Marco didn't understand, but that froze him inside. Then the vision faded, but the images lingered in his mind. Marco looked around, desperate to regain his composure, but something inside him had changed. He knew that he had unleashed something that should not have been touched. One of his companions, Alejandro, approached to examine the object. Without hesitation, he touched it. As soon as he did, he fell to the ground, writhing. He screamed with an unearthly intensity, as if something was piercing him inside, a scream that sounded as if it were eternal, and that was repeated in his mind. The curse. With each passing moment, the curse began to seep into the lives of the expedition members. The days that followed were marked by strange events. Those who stood near the tomb began to experience episodes of unexplained terror. Some saw visions of the future, other times, memories of the past that they had never lived. They were all caught up in their own fears and heartaches, as if each was being haunted by something they could not escape. Marco began to lose control. At night, he saw shadows sliding down the walls of his tent. He felt the cold, clammy hands of someone touching him in the dark. He heard whispers calling his name, voices asking him to undo what he had started. But he was doing it in a language he had never heard before. Worst of all, the shadows resembled the figures he had seen in the tomb, as if those entities were watching his every move. Each of the members of the expedition began to suffer the same. Alejandro could no longer sleep without screaming. Sarah, another of the archaeologists, saw her reflection in a pond, and when she looked at herself, she saw that her face was aged, her eyes empty, as if she had lived a whole life in seconds. The vision disappeared when he stepped away from the water, but the feeling of having seen his future remained. The terror began to overflow when stranger phenomena began to occur. In the middle of the night, everyone woke up feeling bitterly cold. The tomb, despite having closed, seemed to be emanating something, as if it were alive. The team members began to have vivid nightmares, all related to the vision of the desolate city, but more intense, more real. It seemed as if somehow the past was merging with the present. One night, Marco woke up suddenly, feeling a cold presence beside him. As he opened his eyes, he saw a being staring at him from the corner of his tent, a disfigured figure with glowing red eyes, watching him in silence. Fear paralyzed him, unable to move. The figure slowly stretched out his hand towards him, and Marco felt the heavy air almost as if he could touch it. The light from his flashlight flickered before going out completely, and in the darkness, he heard the murmur of voices intensifying. They were voices of despair, voices of the future, of the past, of all who had ever stood near the unmarked grave. Marco finally got up, but as he did so, he saw that his companions were no longer in the tent. The feeling of emptiness was overwhelming, as if everything I had ever known was fading away. The few survivors attempted to leave the site, but the curse had already spread beyond the camp's borders. The desert seemed to consume everything. Marco, exhausted and on the verge of madness, tried to reach a safe place, but the tomb had marked him forever. Finally, Marco found a way to break the cycle. He had to seal the sarcophagus again, close it forever. But in doing so, the vision that had tormented him for so long caught up with him for the last time. The ruined city awaited him, and with it the end he had unleashed. The moment he closed the sarcophagus, the future began to fade, and silence reigned. The tomb, however, would never disappear. The curse would remain, waiting for whoever would discover it again. The cycle would keep repeating, until someone else touched the cursed object. And when that happened, the darkness would return, bringing with it terror and despair forever. The story of the nameless tomb would continue, waiting to be unearthed once again. The house was quiet, as was to be expected at that time of night. A deep, almost oppressive silence that invaded every corner of the house. Joseph was in his bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Since his wife, Anna, had died, everything had changed. The house was no longer the same, and the emptiness left by it was unbearable. Everything in her life seemed to have a gray tinge, a sense of loss that couldn't be dissipated, no matter how hard she tried. Every night in her bed, she felt that something was missing, something that she could never recover. That night, however, the air was different, heavier. The clock struck 3 o'clock in the morning, and Jose still couldn't find comfort. Suddenly, the phone began to ring, interrupting the stillness. It was an unusual sound in the house, as rarely did anyone call him at that hour. The sound of the ringing of the call was almost deafening in the silence, as if it was marked by some kind of foreshadowing. Jose, confused and somewhat frightened, sat up on the bed and looked at the phone. He didn't recognize the number on the screen, but something inside him made him feel like he had to answer. Maybe he thought it was a mistake, some kind of joke from someone playing on his pain, but the truth was that he was too curious and at the same time scared to ignore the call. Breathing heavily, he picked up the phone. "Hello," he said, his voice trembling, hardly knowing why he said it. At first, there was only absolute silence, as deep as there was in the house. Joseph frowned, wondering if it was a joke, until he heard a soft breath as if someone was on the other end of the line. A familiar breath, but one that I did not fully recognize. It was trembling, somewhat broken breathing as if she were struggling to stay calm. And then the voice, soft and muffled, emerged into the earpiece. The voice that Joseph never thought he would hear again. The voice of Hannah, his late wife. It was unmistakable. "Jose, help me." The whole world stopped for an instant. His heart stopped in his chest. Anna's figure, her image, her voice had disappeared from her life months ago. But now, somehow, she was back. The feeling of terror invaded him completely. Was it possible? How could it be her? "Anna? No, this can't be happening," he said, his voice trembling, feeling his mind fogging up, but still clinging to the idea that it might be a hallucination or some kind of trick. "Jose, please help me. I'm trapped. I can't get out," Anna's voice told him with palpable desperation. Joseph looked around the room as if expecting to see something, some hint that he was dreaming. Everything was in place. Everything seemed normal. But the feeling that something strange, something dark, was beginning to settle over the house did not leave him calm. The call continued, and his wife's voice did not stop asking for help. Panic began to rise through his chest, choking his breath. "I didn't know what to think, what to believe, but I had to do something." "Anna, where are you? What's going on?" he asked, almost begging, looking at every corner of the room as if she could appear out of nowhere in front of him. In the house," replied the voice, which now sounded more distorted, more trembling, as if something were interfering with the communication. Anne's voice died briefly away, and Joseph could hear some strange noises in the background, low noises as if someone is walking through the house. His breathing quickened and his hands began to sweat. Was he listening to what he thought he was hearing? "Who's there?" he asked, almost unable to articulate the words. The response was a low laugh, a deep, malevolent sound that chilled Joseph's blood. It was a laugh that didn't belong to his wife, but to something else. Something he couldn't understand. Something that had no form. A shiver ran down his spine. The phone began to emit a series of strange sounds as if the call was being interfered with by something else. And then the voice returned, but now it was much deeper, more ominous. "Jose, don't go. Don't go." The warning only intensified the fear in his chest. Something was wrong. Something dark and sinister had taken the place where he had previously lived with Anna. Joseph got out of bed, the phone still pressed to his ear, and with slow steps, began to walk toward the bedroom door. The sound of the ringing of the call, the buzzing on the line, followed as a constant reminder that something was wrong. Every step he took toward the door was a struggle, a battle between the fear that built up inside him and the need to understand what was happening. He sat on the edge of the bed, then got up again, and with trembling hands began to walk down the hall. The house was dark, as it always was at that time of night. Every creak of the floor beneath his feet seemed to resonate as a sign that something was lurking in the shadows. The house, which had once been his home, now seemed a strange and uninhabited place, full of presences that could not be seen, but that were felt in every corner. With the phone still in his hand, Jose approached the lobby and saw something that made him stop in his tracks. A figure was gliding down the dark hallway, a figure he couldn't clearly distinguish but which looked familiar. It seemed to be flowing, as if it wasn't walking but rather gliding. He couldn't see his face, but he felt the presence, as if that figure was watching him. "Anna, is that you?" he said, his voice trembling as if he were looking for some kind of comfort, something that would give meaning to what he was experiencing. The figure paused for a moment and then faded into the darkness. Fear filled Jose's chest, but even with the phone in his hand, he could not take his eyes off the hallway. A loud knock on the front door broke the silence, a sound so loud that it echoed throughout the house. Joseph took a step back, scared, as his mind tried to process everything that was happening. He slowly approached the door, his breathing being the only thing he could hear. When he reached the door, an icy cold ran through his skin, and a shudder shook him completely. He opened the door cautiously, but there was no one on the other side. Nothing, just the cold night wind. He looked back into the house, and that's when he saw him. In the hallway, a face that belonged to someone who couldn't be real. It was not Anna's face or anyone he knew. It was something else, something moving towards him, slowly approaching. The face was pale, lifeless, with eyes that seemed empty, but with an expression of despair. The hair was messy, and the mouth, which moved slowly, uttered words that Joseph could not understand. At that point, the call was abruptly cut off. The phone fell from his hands, and he stepped back, staring in horror at the figure fading into the darkness. The house was quiet again. Too much silence. As if everything was suspended in the air, waiting for something else to happen. Joseph, paralyzed by fear, did not know what to do. Was his mind playing a cruel joke on him? Was it a dream? No, what I was experiencing could not be real, but the feeling that something dark had invaded her home was so strong that she couldn't ignore it. He felt a cold presence, the feeling that he was not alone, and at that moment he understood everything. The call, the figure, the voice of Anna. She hadn't been asking for help. She had been a warning. The house was now being occupied by something else, something that should not be there. The door to the hall slammed shut. The lights flickered and went out. Joseph looked around, completely surrounded by darkness. He was no longer alone. The sun was beginning to set, bathing the trees of the forest in a golden light that promised a quiet night. A group of friends had ventured into the heart of the evergreen woods to enjoy a weekend of camping. 4 young people, inseparable since childhood, had decided to disconnect from the demands of daily life and immerse themselves in nature, seeking to escape from the routine. A campfire crackled in the center of his makeshift camp, surrounded by the dark shadows cast on the ground by the treetops. Laughter echoed through the tree trunks, but something beyond laughter and stories began to spread through the air. It wasn't a palpable sound or a clear omen, but friends were beginning to feel it. Like an invisible presence watching them lurking from the thicket, Lena, the most outgoing of the group, had decided to explore the terrain a bit while the others pitched their tents. He walked aimlessly, his flashlight illuminating only the immediate surroundings. Soon he found himself in a clearing where the trees opened up, revealing an empty space in which the wind blew with unusual force. It was there that he saw it. A child standing in the middle of the clearing, staring at her. Lena stopped, surprised. The boy didn't look more than 10 years old, his clothes dirty and frayed, as if he'd been wandering in the woods for weeks. "Hello?" Lena asked in a soft voice, although her instinct told her that something was not right. The boy did not respond. He didn't move even a little. Lena felt a strange discomfort, but she forced a smile and took a step towards him. The boy didn't seem to be afraid of the light of his flashlight or its presence. In fact, his gaze was fixed on Lena, as if he was waiting for something, as if he had been waiting for someone. "What are you doing here alone?" Lena asked, not knowing why, but feeling like she had to ask. The boy just moved his head back and forth slowly. Lena felt the air become denser, as if something was oppressing her. His breathing quickened as he stared at the boy's eyes, which seemed too empty to be from such a young child. "You should go back to your friends," Lena murmured, feeling the discomfort take over her body. At that moment, the boy began to slowly walk towards her. Lena, caught between the desire to help him and the growing fear that gripped her, took a few steps back. His flashlight flashed with every step the boy took, and before he could react, the boy disappeared into the trees, as if he had never been there. Lena stood still, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had just seen. He ran back to camp. When he arrived, he found his friends sitting around the campfire, apparently calm, but something in the air, something in their eyes had changed. "Everything is fine?" Mark asked him, the most serious of the group. "I saw a child in the woods," Lena said, her voice trembling. "He was alone. He seemed lost. But something wasn't right. I don't know how to explain it." "A child?" Ethan said, arching an eyebrow. "Are you sure what you saw?" Lena nodded, but her words didn't seem to fully convince her friends. However, the concern on their faces indicated that the idea that something strange was happening was already in their heads. They decided that it would be best to stay close to the camp and not go further into the forest that night. The hours passed slowly, and darkness took over the place. The sound of the wind moving the leaves of the trees created an unsettling sound, while the campfire continued to burn weakly. But it was when the clock struck midnight that terror began to grow among them. A loud bang, as if something heavy had fallen nearby, made everyone rise with a start. The light of the campfire trembled as the wind seemed to increase in intensity. Everyone looked silently at the edge of the camp, where the darkness seemed even thicker than before. Something was not right. "Did you hear that?" Andrea whispered, her face pale. There was no response, only the sound of their breaths. Fear took hold of each one as they looked around, looking for a rational explanation for what they had just heard. It was then that the child appeared again. This time he was not alone. Beside him, a taller, more somber figure stood tall like a shadow above him. The boy was walking, but the figure behind him seemed to move at his own pace, moving unhurriedly, but without stopping. The friends froze, watching silently as the boy slowly approached, as if he was walking towards them. "Don't move," Ethan whispered, grabbing Lena's arm. But it was too late. The boy had reached the edge of the campfire. His face, pale and gloomy, was now clearer, and the emptiness in his eyes seemed to engulf all the light around him. "Go away!" Mark shouted, but the boy did not move. Suddenly, the figure behind the boy completely materialized. She was not human. His body was a mass of shadows, his red eyes glowing with terrifying intensity, and his presence seemed to absorb all the light around him. The darkness around her stretched out as if she were alive, enveloping everything in its path. Who are you?" Andrea asked, her words coming out with difficulty. The figure did not answer. The boy took a step forward, and immediately the shadow followed. The friends got up and began to retreat, but shadows seemed to take over everything around them. The air had become heavy, unbreathable, as if an invisible weight were crushing them. That's when it all fell apart. The boy raised his hand, pointing towards them. The ground trembled, and a dark shadow emerged from the ground, enveloping everyone's legs. Screams filled the air, but the sound seemed to drown out nothingness. Lena tried to move her legs, but the darkness held her tight. The boy smiled, an empty smile, devoid of emotion. His eyes shone with an unearthly glow. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice a low echo. Suddenly, the shadow around them began to twist, as if it had a life of its own, and the friends felt the pressure mounting. Fear paralyzed them. The darkness seemed to swallow them little by little. The boy began to disappear, merging into the shadow, as the figure behind him faded like a whisper into nothingness. The friends, trapped in the darkness, felt the piercing cold around them. They couldn't move, they couldn't breathe, trapped in an endless nightmare. The last vision they had was of the boy, slowly fading into the shadows, his laughter echoing in their minds, an echo that would never fade. It was a gray afternoon, one that did not presage anything out of the ordinary. Jonas, a 34-year-old man, didn't usually think too much about the supernatural, nor did he believe in legends or ghost stories. His life was simple, structured. He had lost his wife a year ago in a car accident, and since then, he had dedicated himself to maintaining his daily routine, not wanting to look back too much. However, that day, something in the air seemed different. The fog seemed thicker, and the shadows on the walls seemed to move inexplicably. It wasn't the first time he'd seen strange things since Laura's death, but he'd never paid much attention to it. Until that day. Jonah had been looking for something to fill the void left by his beloved's departure, something to distract him from the heavy burden of memories that suffocated him every night. That's when he saw the sign. Antiquities of the West. The shop seemed to have been there for centuries, its facade aged and its windows covered in the dust of time. It was the kind of place that, if it weren't for curiosity, one would avoid. Inside, the air was dense, laden with quiet stories, with objects that seemed to whisper dark secrets. Jonah walked between the shelves, watching without really seeing, until something called him. A mirror, framed in an aged gold, with a design so intricate that it seemed impossible that it could have been made by a human hand. The reflection in the glass was strange. His face was not visible, only a faint distortion. His heart beat a little faster, and for an instant a chill ran down his spine. What kind of mirror was this? The store owner, a man with a wrinkled face and cloudy eyes, approached silently. "That mirror has a story," he said, his voice raspy as if coming from the bowels of the earth. "They say it's been passed from hand to hand, and every time the person who owns it sees things they shouldn't see." Jonah looked at him, skeptical. "Little things like what?" "Figures, presences," murmured the owner. "Figures who are not in the room, but who are getting closer. Some called it the mirror of death, but everyone has their own experience with it." Jonah laughed, uncomfortable, not really believing what the man was saying. "How much does it cost?" The owner smiled unsettlingly. "It's a valuable object, but if you really want it, I can leave it to you for a reasonable price." Jonah paid without much thought. Perhaps in his subconscious, what he was looking for was not just the mirror, but something that would disconnect him from his pain. something that would distract him from his constant feeling of emptiness. He took it home that same afternoon, placing the mirror in the main living room, just in front of the window where the shadows at nightfall could play with the reflections. The first night, Jonah didn't notice anything strange. He sat in front of the mirror several times, watching the reflection of the furniture and the fading light outside the window. But something began to change the next day. The image reflected in the mirror seemed altered. It wasn't obvious at first, but when I looked closer, I could see fuzzy shapes that didn't belong in the room. Shadowy figures of subtle, barely discernible movements. He thought it was his mind, affected by fatigue, playing tricks with him. But the following nights were different. The figure began to be clearer. At first, it was just a human-shaped shadow that was silhouetted on the glass. Then it seemed to move, getting a little closer each night. Jonah, who had always been logical, rational, began to feel uncomfortable. I couldn't stop looking at the mirror. He couldn't help but feel that something was watching him from the other side of the glass. It was not a simple reflection. It was not a dream. The figure in the mirror had vague outlines, but it was evident that it was a person, tall, thin, with a dark cloak. At night, the shadow seemed to move with an eerie slowness, moving slowly, almost at the same pace as his breathing. Jonah closed his eyes one night, but he couldn't help but open them. The figure was closer, now barely a meter away from him in the reflection. His mind struggled to rationalize what he saw. It's just a trick of light, he thought, but he couldn't look away. There was something in that reflection that held him captive. Panic began to settle in his chest every time he approached that mirror. Why couldn't he get away? Why did he feel that something was drawing him to him, as if he was being called from another world? As the days passed, the figures in the mirror became clearer. He was no longer just a shadow. She was a woman, ethereal-looking, with long hair that seemed to float around her. His eyes, empty with emotion, watched Jonah with an intensity that paralyzed him. Sometimes he could hear whispers, though he couldn't understand the words. They seemed to come from everywhere and yet from nowhere at the same time. It was as if the air itself were impregnated with a cursed prescription. Jonah tried to cover the mirror, but every time he did, he woke up the next day to find it uncovered, as if nothing had happened. The figure in the mirror not only got closer each night, but it seemed more alive, more real. Somehow she knew that he was watching her, that he felt her, and when he looked at him, she would get a step closer. One night, Jonah decided not to sleep. He spent hours staring at the mirror, waiting to see what would happen if he didn't close his eyes. The figure, that spectral woman, began to move quickly. As soon as the clock struck midnight, she began to rise, and Jonah could see his hands reaching out to the glass. The shadow, or whatever it was, touched the mirror and the glass froze. The air became dense, heavy, as if time itself had stopped. Jonah got up in terror and took a step back, but it wasn't enough. Suddenly, his body was paralyzed. The contours of the figure in the mirror began to overflow, stretching, taking the form of a human silhouette slowly emerging towards him. The woman in the mirror was no longer just a shadow. I was there, standing in front of him, as if I had gone through reality itself. What are you?" Jonah managed to whisper, his lips dry. The woman did not answer, but raised her hand. An absolute cold ran through his body. His vision began to blur. Suddenly, Jonah understood. The mirror didn't just show reflections, it was a portal. A portal to the other side, a step towards death. And that figure, that entity, had been waiting for him. Terror overwhelmed him, but he couldn't move. He couldn't scream. The woman raised her other hand, pointing to the mirror. Reality began to crumble, and Jonah felt the essence of his being slowly drain away. The figure smiled at him, an empty smile that ran cold in the blood. And in that instant, Jonah knew that he could no longer escape. The house that had been his refuge was now his prison, and the mirror was his sentence. The woman touched him, and the darkness absorbed him. There was no shouting. There was no resistance. Just an endless emptiness. The next morning, the antique shop closed. The owner disappeared, and the mirror again became part of the store. No one knew who had bought it this time. No one could guess who would be the next victim of the mirror of death, because the mirror did not forget.